like to introduce our first speaker from Brainy, who is Dr. Jeffrey Cohen. He's a senior advisor at HRP Consulting Group. Dr. Cohen has had over 30 years experience in human research protections. He was also the founder of HRP Associates in 2005. For 20 years, he served in the Office for Research at the University at Albany, State University of New York, as the Associate Director for Research Compliance and Information Management. In this role, he was responsible for the administration of the IRB, as well as the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. He then served as Director, Division of Education and Development in the Office for Human Research Protections in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for 4 years. Following his service there, he served as Associate Dean, responsible conduct of research at Weill Medical College of Cornell University. Since leaving Cornell, Dr. Cohen has been an independent consultant. He's been an active contributor to national discussions of human subjects issues since 1979 and is a highly visible participant in national meetings, such as those sponsored by the Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, and is past president of the Applied Research Ethics National Association. He's a certified IRB professional, and in 2009 won the prestigious Arena Legacy Award for his contribution to human research protections. So I'd like to introduce now Dr. Jeffrey Cohen.
Well, first of all, which is probably very obvious to you already, I have a cold. So you're going to have to bear with me as I cough and hack and wheeze through this. One other aspect of my resume, which I've been doing this for almost 40, it's at over 30, it's almost 40 now. I started working with IRB in 1979. I'm speaking to audiences now where there are people who weren't born yet. For 20 years was responsible for the IRB at the University at Albany, and that was primarily a social behavioral IRB. It's not a biomedical IRB. After leaving Albany, a lot of the rest of my career has been focused, in addition to social behavioral research, but also biomedical. But more relevantly today, I am the chair of the Brainy Social Behavioral IRB. So I'm the one that actually reviews. Joyce does the initial review. I'm the one that approves the research you submit to Brainy. And you'll see, we have a consulting group, HRP Consulting Group, which is a division of Brainy. So we merged about 2 years ago with Brainy, so it's a joint effort. So we're all one big happy family now. And those of you, how many people here have taken the CITI online course? Probably, I hope most of you. CITI is now also part of Brainy. So we've created this multifaceted group. And about a year ago, we decided to, because Brainy, the main Brainy IRB is primarily biomedical. And they review biomedical research, clinical trials, investigational drug research. And then in talking with the people at Brainy after we merged with them, we said, well, how about starting a social behavioral IRB, independent social behavioral IRB. And I think we're the only independent social behavioral IRB around. And we thought that was a good idea, and we set up the IRB. And then we were approached by CAU to be your IRB, and we were very happy to do that, and it's worked out to be a very good relationship. So what I'm going to cover this morning, you're stuck with me for the morning, you get Joyce in the afternoon. I'm going to cover this morning 3 basic topics. First, we're going to talk about what requires IRB review, what does need IRB review, and in doing that, I'll talk a little bit about how we review each of the various aspects of this. Then, after we've done that, I'm going to let you in on a secret. And so the next presentation is the secret to getting your research approved by the IRB. I'm going to let you in on a secret. And then at the end, and we've been asked to talk specifically because a lot of you are doing research involving data and analyzing data and data from clinical interventions. And so we'll talk a bit about that and how that's done. So I'm here to talk about sort of the basics. Then Joyce will talk this afternoon about how to do this. And a little bit, and Joyce will share a little bit of what we've learned after the several months that we've been working with you guys and reviewing your protocols and what we've learned. And then she'll talk about some practical aspects of submitting protocols. So that's our goal today. So we're going to start off talking about what requires IRB review. And basically, when you've got an activity that involves information from or about human subjects, so either you're interacting with human subjects, or you're gathering information about human subjects, or you're gathering information from human subjects, there are 3 questions to ask, and in this order. First, is it human subjects research? And we have we'll talk about that. What is human subjects research? Is it covered by the regulations and policy? And third, does it require review by the full IRB? So let's start. Is it human subjects research? So there is a regulatory definition of human subjects research. And there's 2 parts to it. First, is it research under the regulations? And research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Now, and a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual, or obtains identifiable private information. So, is it human research? Depends on several factors. First, is it a systematic investigation? Is it a systematic investigation? Now, what do we mean by a systematic investigation? A systematic investigation is a planned research activity designed to gather information from or about human subjects for the purpose of answering a scientific question. Now that's to differentiate clinical information. So if you're a clinician, of course you're gathering information on your clients. Okay? You're doing that for clinical purposes. You're doing that to help the client. That's not a systematic investigation. It's to differentiate that research from case studies. Good clinicians do case studies and sometimes publish case studies. And I'm sure you've seen publications or books with case studies. A case study is not a systematic investigation. Case study is, this happened with this person. Okay? That's a case study. A systematic investigation is when you are gathering information, usually about more than one person, and you're analyzing that information to answer a scientific question. I don't like to use the term test a hypothesis, because test a hypothesis implies quantitative research, but we're not just talking about quantitative research. Qualitative research is still research. Qualitative research isn't done to test a hypothesis, but it is done to answer a question. The most famous qualitative researcher in history was Darwin. Darwin didn't do any experiments. Darwin observed and drew conclusions from what he observed. That was qualitative research. There was no hypothesis. He was doing observation. He was doing qualitative research. There are a lot of social and behavioral researchers that primarily do qualitative research. That's still research because they're systematically gathering information to answer and analyzing that information to answer a scientific question. Does everybody get that? So it's a matter of thinking about what are we doing, okay? And why are we doing it? What are we doing and why are we doing it? The second part of the definition is intended to contribute to generalizable knowledge. Again, that case study, okay, is contributing to general knowledge because you're publishing it so other people can learn from your case study. So it's not a systematic investigation, but it is contributing to generalizable knowledge. But it's got to be both a systematic investigation and contributing to generalizable knowledge. The purpose of the generalizable knowledge part of the definition is to differentiate research from quality improvement. So, for example, as I said, clinicians gather information about their clients. A good clinician will analyze that information to answer the question, how am I doing as a clinician? Am I doing a good job? Are my clients improving? Am I having an impact? That's quality improvement. You're doing that for yourself. You're doing that to improve your practice. A program, a clinic, could analyze the data from the clinic and use that information to improve the practice in the clinic. That's not generalizable data. Okay? Sometimes that gets published, but still it's about a clinic. It's about your practice. It's not generalizable. The idea of generalizable means I'm doing this research so that the world will benefit from it, so that scientific knowledge will advance. Okay, and so publishing is one aspect of contributing to generalizable knowledge, but it's not the only way we contribute to generalizable knowledge. We give presentations at conferences and workshops. Okay? We do posters at conferences and workshops. That's still contributing to generalizable knowledge. And there's one little sort of catch here. Dissertations are always considered contributing to generalizable knowledge because they're put in a library and accessible. All dissertations are accessible through databases. Okay? So you're not doing that for yourself, although you're getting the degree. You're doing it because someone can benefit from your research. So publication isn't the only definition or only criterion for determining whether something's generalizable or not. So does everybody get what research is? Okay. Now, not all research involves human subjects. Let me phrase this better, that there are activities that meet the definition of research that gather information from human subjects, from human beings, but it's not human subjects research. To be human subjects research, first of all, it has to be a living individual. I remember when I was at the IRB, we got a call that some graduate student wanted to get information from gravestones. I said, I don't think that's human subjects research. And I don't know how you would get consent anyway. So if you can figure out how to get consent, then I'll say it's human subjects research. So it's got to be a living individual. So there are people who do research on death records, on public health records of deceased individuals. There are medical researchers that do use specimens from cadavers or deceased individuals. That's not human subjects research. It's got to be a living individual. The data that's obtained has to be about the people that you're studying. Okay? It's got to be about them. Now, why is that important? And then, I don't know if they have a program here, but at many universities they have programs in organizational psychology. And organizational psychologists often go into an organization and interview people about how the organization works. The questions they're asking are not about the people they're interviewing, it's about the organization. So technically, that may not be human subjects research. There's sort of a gray, fuzzy area there, but I know we had an organizational psychology program at the university when I was there, and it was always a question, when is it about the organization and when is it about the people? So it was fuzzy. But it's got to be about the people you're obtaining the information, not about an organization, not about other things. It's got to be about them. And the data is obtained through intervention or interaction with the subjects. A questionnaire is an interaction. You don't have to physically interact with the subjects to be doing human subjects research. So doing a survey, doing a questionnaire, a mailed questionnaire, an online questionnaire, that's still an interaction. You're interacting with the person. So doing a survey, it counts as an interaction. Or obtaining private identifiable information about a person. Okay? Now, it's got to be private information. And private information is information that people don't reasonably expect will be shared with others. So, for example, when you're gathering your clinical information, there isn't a reasonable assumption that you're going to share that with anyone. The assumption of your clients is you won't. Okay, so that's private information. And it's got to be identifiable information about them. And identifiable, the phrase that's used in the regulations is the identity of the subject is readily ascertainable. Of course, the regulations don't define what readily ascertainable means. I've always said if you have to hire a team of detectives or you have to hire a team of computer hackers to figure out who the people are, then that's not readily ascertainable. So I always get questions about, they're signing on to do this online survey and I may be able to get their IP address. Come on. That's not readily ascertainable. Yes, theoretically, you might be, you've seen it on TV where the hackers can identify who's been using what computer. That's not readily ascertainable. Okay? I should mention, and I'll talk later when we talk about confidentiality, that names are not the only identifiers. And there are other ways to readily identify people. Right. So, when you're doing something where they're gathering information from or about people, okay, your activity involves gathering information from or about people, you've got to answer these questions. Is it a systematic investigation? Is it designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge? And does it involve human subjects? So if the answer is yes to all of those questions, now we're moving into the IRB world. Yeah. I mean, the dissertations, as I understand it, are always considered. But, there's a big fuzzy gray area there. And that's why one of the things, and we can talk about later, and Joyce can talk about, we do have a form where if you're not sure that what you're doing is human subjects research, you can give us the information about what you're doing, and we'll make that determination for you. Hold that thought. There is a way to do that. That doesn't mean you can never publish that or you can never do that. But there is a way. Joyce. Yeah. Yeah, so an anonymous survey is still an interaction. Okay? But getting anonymous data on people, say from a center, may not be human subject research. And we'll talk when we get to the end. We talk about data and and this, okay, I was in Washington for 4 years, and one of the things I learned in Washington was the answer to every question is, it depends. So when I say may not, it's because it depends. And nothing in what we do, there are no hard lines here. There are a lot of gray fuzzy lines. So everything that I'm going to talk about is may be, maybe. Okay, so if you're doing a classroom research project, you're going through, it's probably a systematic investigation, but then we get to the second question. Is it designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge? And most classroom projects, as much as we'd like to think, they're going to contribute to generalizable knowledge, they're going to advance science. They don't. And that's not the intent. The intent is to train the students. And they may get shared, the information may get shared within the class, but it's not intended to go beyond that. The purpose is to train students. If the class project is intended to produce, and most people talk about publishable results, is intended to contribute to scientific knowledge, and is done that way, and is put out there through a poster, or presentation, or publication, then it may be. It's that word may. It may be. And that's why we have that form. Because these are gray, fuzzy things. There's a lot of maybe here, and you shouldn't have to be making that decision on your own. So we have a mechanism, so we'll help you make that decision. Probably not. Yes. It depends. Yes, that's always a good idea. That's not exactly true, but we'll get to that. Now, part of that, and we've been talking about a regulatory definition. Part of that is a university decision. And the university has its own policies. So at our university, when I was at the University of Albany, our definition of human subjects research was the purpose of the activity is to contribute to generalizable knowledge or train students. We wanted to review, and I could tell you why, but there's a reason for that, but we wanted to review student research, and that was a university policy, not covered under the regulations. The university decided all student research had to come to the IRB. So that's up to the university. And you can decide as a university how you want to handle student research. Because, and here's one of the reasons why we did that, those student project activities still have ethical issues. They're still, if they're dealing with human subjects, it still has ethical issues. So, and we're happy if the university decides that's what it wants to do, we're happy to do that as an IRB. Any other questions? Because this is really important. This slide is one of the most important slides. So, any other questions? Okay. Now, we've said it is human subject research. Okay. Is it covered by the regulations? And the regulations state, and Albizu's policy is to follow the regulations even if it's not federally funded. Unless otherwise required, research activities in which the only involvement of human subjects, so we already established it is human subjects research, okay, but it may be exempt from the detailed requirements of the regulations. Now when I say that, we've already said it's human subjects research. There may be ethical issues. It's not exempt from ethical issues, from ethical review. But all of the details in the regulations don't apply. So we could say, okay, in this study, for ethical purposes, you should get consent. Well, obtaining consent in the regulations has all kinds of rules. There's all kinds of information that has to be provided. You may need a written consent form. There's all this stuff in the regulations about consent. That doesn't necessarily apply to exempt research. So we have a form, and you come and you say, okay, it is human subjects research, but we think it's exempt. And I'll talk about what makes it exempt. And exempt is it's got to be in a certain category. That means that all of those details in the regulations don't apply. Ethical concerns still apply, but all those details in the regulations do not apply. It's really there for very innocuous research. Very, very innocuous research. Exempt was designed to be that sort of bucket of research that's so benign and so innocuous that we don't have to follow all the detailed rules. It's still human subjects research. There are still ethical issues that have to be looked at. Okay? And the other thing, we'll talk about this when we get to the next level, it's not always clear. We'll see when I show you the categories. It's not always clear that it meets the criteria for exemption. So you may think it's exempt, and you submit it to us for an exemption, and we look at it, and we go, no, it's an exempt. It's got to go through expedited review. So, there are these fuzzy lines, and that's what we're here for, to help you with. Okay, so these are the categories of research, and again, it is human subjects research. We've already said that. That are considered exempt. Normal educational practices in established educational settings. Here's the catch. Regulations don't define normal educational practices or established educational settings. So I'll give you a negative example. So when I was at OHRP in Washington, I got a call from a researcher who was very angry about the IRB at his institution. He said, I'm doing research. I think this is exempt. My IRB keeps saying, no, it's not. So we said, what are you doing? He was doing, and I don't know if you're familiar with this field. I wasn't really before. The field of experimental economics. Experimental economics is where you bring people into a lab, and you have them do these computer games, and you manipulate rewards, and you manipulate cooperation to obtain, you've seen those studies, they manipulate cooperation to receive rewards, and they're really trying to study how people make economic decisions. So he was bringing subjects, he was recruiting subjects, bringing them into a lab, having them do these computer games, manipulating things about the activity they were doing, and he said, that's a normal educational practice. Students use computers all the time. And I'm doing it at a university, so it's an educational setting. And we said, no. That is not a normal educational practice. Okay? Normal educational practices, and when I was at the university, we had a guideline for deciding whether it met this criterion, that the researcher was not disrupting what was ordinarily happening in the classroom. They were observing or recording or looking at results from a class, but they weren't disrupting what was ordinarily happening in the class. So if you're looking at different curricula, you're looking at different teaching methods, you're looking at how effective different teachers are, instructors are, that's normal educational practice. You're not disrupting the class, you're not having them do anything experimental, you're not having them testing anything. Okay? That's a normal educational practice. Now, the established educational settings is there because we're not just talking about a school. It could be a trade school, it could be a training situation. I was just doing a presentation the day before yesterday at an Army base, and they do training for their recruits, and they were asking whether these studying how they do training would qualify, and I said, yeah, that's training Army recruits, you're in an established educational setting. Okay, got that one. It's still vague. It's not hard cut. Okay, educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observation of public behavior. Okay? So the educational tests are that you're studying, you're giving students a test, or you're studying tests that students are given. Surveys and interviews, observation of behavior, unless it is both identifiable and sensitive. So, anonymous surveys, even if they're on very sensitive information, you could do an anonymous survey that asks about substance abuse and sexual misconduct and criminal activity and all of that, but if it's totally anonymous, it's exempt. You could do a survey that asks all detailed information about a person, their social security number, their telephone number, their address, their name, everything about them, but if it's on an innocuous subject, it's exempt. Okay? So the only surveys and interviews that aren't exempt are those that are both identifiable and on sensitive subjects, which is not many. I mean, and there's a way to do that. We'll get to how you do that in a couple minutes. That doesn't mean you can't do those. It means that they're not exempt. Ever got that? So almost all surveys are exempt. Research using existing data that already exists, records, if they're publicly available, okay, and publicly means anyone can access them. Okay. For example, you could do research on census data. You can apply to the Census Bureau and get census data. It's public information. You can get that. So that's publicly available. Or recorded without identifiers. Now you're going to say, well, wait, we just said that if it's not private identifiable information, it's not human subjects research. Okay? So and the issue here is access. To say it's not human subjects research, that means the investigator has no access to the identifiers. Can't access the identifiers. Here, we're saying the investigator can access the identifiers, but isn't recording them. So let's say you're working in a clinic, and you want to use the data from the clinic. So you're going to go into the client records, but you're not interested in any identifiable information. You're not going to record any identifiable information. You're just going to record unidentifiable information. That's exempt. Okay. Everybody follow that? You can see where, a lot of gray fuzzy lines here, but yeah, that's exempt. Okay, the other three over there, forget them. Simple. Just don't pay any attention to them. Unless you have a political science department, I don't know if you're doing research on elected or public officials. And when we say, well, at the university we said, you have to, that only applies to their official duties. You can't do psychological analysis of elected or public officials. That's not exempt. But if you're, you're talking to, there are a lot of political scientists. That's what they do. That's exempt. Or candidates. So I don't think you guys do much of that, but if you were, it's exempt. Evaluation of public benefit service programs. This only applies to federal public benefit programs, particularly under the Social Security Administration. In fact, Social Security Administration required that be included. I don't know if you know, but CMS, which oversees the Social Security, they do all kinds of experiments. And they were, back in the day when these regulations were written, they were doing things like dividing the country up and doing different benefit programs in different parts of the country to see what worked. And they didn't want that to go to the IRB. So they required that be included. So unless you're doing that, which I doubt, this doesn't apply. And I don't know how much taste and food quality research you do here. But if you did, that's really for ag schools. They do that. Ag schools do that. Nutrition departments sometimes do that. But I don't think you guys do. So I don't think any of those three apply to any of you. So here we're talking about educational research, surveys, interviews, and existing data. Those are the main categories of exemption. Again, we have a form. Joyce can talk a little more about that. And we'll help you make that determination. OHRP's guidance on exemptions is that institutions should have a clear policy on who makes the exemption determination. Me. We do. The persons having the authority have to be well acquainted with the regulations, us. And investigators can't make that determination. So you can't decide that you can say, I think it's exempt, and you submit your research on the form requesting an exemption determination, but we make that determination. And we may say no. Well, I'll tell you the two things that come up, and they already have come up in some things. You submit your research, you think it's exempt, and we'll say, no, it's not human subjects research. It's really not human subjects research. Or we'll say, no, it's not exempt, it needs to go for expedited review. So but most of the time, when you submit something that's exempt, we say, yep, that's exempt. Any questions about exemptions? And the point about exemptions is that, again, I'll repeat, that it isn't exempt from ethical review. It's exempt. I mean, a lot of people say that, and I get irritated. I go around to various institutions, and what they'll say for exempt is it's exempt from IRB review. No, that's not what the regulations say. It's exempt from the detailed requirements of the regulations. It's not exempt from ethical review, because there still could be ethical issues in exempt research. We could still say you need to obtain consent. We could still have concerns about risk. That is a university issue. Are you authorized to do this? That's a university issue. That might be the clinic's policy. And some clinics will say, no, we don't want any research done on our data, regardless of whether it meets this qualification. HIPAA is another story. I hate HIPAA. I hate HIPAA. Most people do. Well, it depends. I told you, it's every question. So the thing about HIPAA is about covered entities. And is the source of the data a covered entity? It doesn't matter with the researcher. So if you're a researcher from Albizu, it's not whether Albizu is a covered entity. It's not whether you're covered by HIPAA. Because HIPAA is about releasing information, not obtaining information. So can the clinic release that information? And they're the ones that have to follow HIPAA, not the researcher. So HIPAA is on the other side. Still, it's up to the clinic to decide whether to release that information to the researcher. Okay? So that's, so at most universities, the university itself is either not covered, not a covered entity. Covered entity mostly has to do with electronic billing. That's the main criterion for a covered entity. In most universities are not covered entities, or they're what's called a hybrid. And usually it's the health center. If a university has a health center, the health center is a covered entity, but not the university. If you have a clinic, the clinic is the covered entity, not the university. Okay? It's the clinic that has to follow HIPAA. Right, and then that's, like I said, that they have to make sure that it's okay with the clinic for the clinic to release that information, even if they work at the clinic. So remember, one of these things, and we get this often with people working at clinics, people working, teachers in schools. So I had a teacher once said, "Oh, I'm just going to use my own students' records. They're my records." Well, they're your records as a teacher. They're not your records as a researcher. You got to change your hat. So if you work at the clinic, you can access those records for the benefit of your clients, but not necessarily for research. Once you put on that researcher hat, okay, now you're a researcher. Now you have to follow these regulations and perhaps HIPAA. Well, first of all, there should be some written documentation somehow from the source of the data. And we as an IRB would want to see that. Okay, it's not sort of a regulatory thing, but we want to make sure that you do have authority to access that data. I would say it would come from it has to come from the source of the data. Now, if that person has and that person has to have authority. So your supervisor may not have the authority to grant you that permission. So it should be coming from someone who has the authority at the source of the data. Mm-hmm. Depends on how different organizations are set up differently. So I guess the bottom line is, before you do this, you've got to check with the source of the data. What's their policy? Who can give you permission? I think from our perspective, from the IRB's perspective, as long as you have something from that organization, we're not going to question who because we're not concerned about the clinic. But it's your responsibility to make sure that you're getting permission from the appropriate person, and you can document that. And part of it is courtesy as well. So, for example, we had at the university, we had students that want to go to the mall and do a survey. Well, we wanted to make sure it was okay with the mall for that student to be there doing the survey. You know, or going to school, you have permission from the school. By the way, if you're doing any research in schools, public schools, okay, the principal does not have that authority. Only the school district has that authority. In most school districts, the principal does not have the authority to grant permission for research, because the principal is responsible for what goes on in that building. It's school district policy under most state law. So you've got to get permission from the school district. And most school districts have someone, usually it's an assistant superintendent, that can give you that permission. Private schools, it's the headmaster. Well, part of this is university policy on what, and we've gotten into this a little bit about collaborative research and so forth, and what needs to come to us. Let me put it this way. It can't hurt to submit to us. You may not even need to, but if you submit it to us, we'll accept it and review it. There are some issues that have to be dealt with at the university level about other IRBs and research that's approved by other IRBs. That's a university policy. Any more questions about exempt? I hate that word, by the way, because it sounds like, oh, I don't need to do anything, I'm not going to worry about anything. I prefer administrative review. It does need administrative review. So, there are a lot of words in the regulations I'd get rid of, and this is one of them. Okay. It is human subjects research, meets the definition of human subjects research. It's not exempt, doesn't qualify for exemption. Okay, that means it has to be reviewed by the IRB. Okay, we're still, okay, so here's the, let me sort of, again, we've got hats. So when I look at an exempt study, I'm looking at it as, I'm doing that for you. The regulations say the investigator can't make that determination, so I'm making that determination for you. I'm doing that as an expert in the field, who happens to be the chair of the IRB, but I'm actually not doing it as chair of the IRB, I'm doing it as an expert in the field. And Joyce could do that, you know, that you know, doesn't have to be, so it's technically not being reviewed by the IRB. If it's not exempt, if it is human subjects research and it's not exempt, then it has to be reviewed by the IRB. But not all research has to be reviewed by the full IRB. We have a committee. The committee meets and reviews certain studies. Perfectly honestly, we've only done that once. Just, was it last week or the week before? Last week, we had our first full IRB meeting. Most research, particularly most social behavioral research, doesn't require full IRB review. But, so what it is expedited review. Now, another word I'd like to throw out. What does expedited review sound like? Fast and easy. No. The only difference between full IRB review and expedited IRB review is who does it. Expedited review is just as thorough, just as intense, just as complete, same documentation, same materials, exactly the same as full IRB review, but it doesn't require a full IRB review meeting. Okay. It's carried out by the IRB chair or one or more IRB members. In our case, me. I'm the chair. I do all the expedited reviews. The difference between exempt, when I look at an exempt study, and when I look at an expedited review study, as an exempt study, like I said, I'm an expert in the field. When I look at review an expedited review study, I'm the chair of the IRB. I'm acting on behalf of the IRB. To you, it doesn't make any difference. But to me, it does. I think about it differently when I look at what I'm doing. So expedited review is allowed for minimal risk research on a list of eligible categories, okay, or minor changes in previously approved research, very little changes in previously approved research. It's carried out by the IRB chair or one or more members. As chair of the IRB, when I review an expedited study, I have all of the authority of the IRB. So I can require changes for approval, I can grant waivers of consent, I can do everything the IRB can do, except I can't disapprove a study. Only the full IRB. So if you were to submit a study under expedited review, and I looked at it, and I said, oh, this is terrible, you shouldn't do this. By the way, I'd never say that. But let's say I did. Hypothetically, I looked at this as horrible, it should not be done. Okay? I couldn't do that under expedited review. I'd have to call an IRB meeting and have the full IRB disapprove the study, which is the way it should be. One person shouldn't make that decision. Okay? Never happen. We don't disapprove anything. And I also have to inform all of the IRB members of everything approved under expedited review. So any IRB member could say, wait, we don't think that should have been approved. And they could call a meeting. Again, it doesn't happen, but could. Now, what makes something minimal risk research? The definition of minimal risk research, the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or doing the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations. Now, the key here is in and of themselves. It's the harms in and of themselves. So the question you need to ask as to whether what I'm doing is minimal risk is how much does the research I'm doing increase the risk to subjects? And is that increase more than what we face in daily life? It's not zero. We don't talk about no risk. That term doesn't exist in this field. We don't live in a risk-free world. There's a certain amount of risk we all face every day, but it's minimal risk. Well, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Okay, but we face risk. We could get hit by a truck. You know, it's not a risk-free world, but it's a minimal risk. The likelihood we're going to get hit by a truck is minimal. You know, so it's a risk. It's not zero risk, and that's not what we look for. We don't look for zero risk. We look for minimal risk. That level we face in everyday life. And it's how much risk are you adding? So let's say you're a psychologist and you're studying depression and suicide. And the subjects in your research are individuals diagnosed with severe clinical depression. Okay? Those people face a lot of risk because of their condition. And they face a risk of suicide. That suicide is a real risk for people who are clinically depressed. Okay? But that's not the right question. The question is, how much are we increasing the risk to those subjects by our research? And it very well may be that you're not increasing the risk to subjects by the research. So for example, I'll give you an example, and it's a dated example. So back in the early 80s, the first depression inventories were being developed. They're pretty common now, but they were fairly new then. And the Beck depression inventory, all those. And there was the IRB and our IRB too had a real concern because some of those questions in that depression inventory, for example, there are questions about suicidal ideation. Can asking those questions increase the risk of suicide? That was a real concern. And back in the day, back in the early 80s, we considered those more than minimal risk studies. We said by asking those questions, you're increasing the risk to the subjects. Well, lo and behold, some people did some empirical research, and what they found was, no. Not only does asking those questions not increase the risk, it decreases the risk. Talking about it, being asked about it, decreases the risk. Okay? But it certainly does not, and none of the empirical evidence shows that it increases risk. So that's the question. Are you increasing the risk to subjects? It's not what the subjects are already facing. Is it, are you increasing the risk? Got it? Okay. Okay, these are the relevant categories. There's a lot of categories of expedited review that aren't relevant to social behavioral research. These are the three that are most relevant. Research involving materials that have been collected or will be collected for non-research purposes. The question that was asked about the program evaluation, and you did a program evaluation, you decided it wasn't human subjects research, but we found something really interesting. And we do want to publish this, we do want to share this. Okay? It's not exempt, and it wasn't human subjects, but it wasn't human subjects research when you gathered it. It comes under this category. It was collected for non-research purposes. It was collected for quality improvement, not human subjects research. So you can still do it, but now it'll be expedited review. Also, this category is used. Remember I said the exempt category was for existing data. So it's retrospective reviews. What if you're doing a prospective review? You want to look at the next 10 patients that come in to the clinic. Not exempt, but it comes under here, will be collected. So this allows for prospective records review. Collection of data from voice, video, digital, or image recordings. And here comes my favorite. Research on individual or group characteristics or behavior. Can anybody give me an example of any social or behavioral research that is not about individual or group characteristics or behavior? That's the definition of social behavioral research. Okay? So almost all minimal risk social behavioral research is eligible for expedited review. Okay? We got that? And that's why most of what we review under expedited review. But it's got to be minimal risk. Most important thing to remember about expedited review, I've already made the point, expedited review is not review light. When I do an expedited review, I use the same checklist the full board does. I go through the same materials. You're asked to submit the same materials. It's the same. It's just who does it. So, all non-exempt human research, human subjects research, all human subjects research that does not qualify for expedited review requires review by the full committee. And then we have to convene the meeting, and the full board decides. Any questions about what requires IRB review before we go on? Vulnerable populations could qualify for expedited review. However, unless they're prisoners don't. But they do qualify for expedited review. However, there's always a question with vulnerable populations about risk. And deciding whether something is minimal risk for a vulnerable population is different than deciding about risk for normal, healthy adults, competent adults. So, for example, we just had an IRB meeting, and the main reason for that IRB meeting is that it involved children. I didn't want to do that under expedited review. There were concerns, there were issues about the use of the children and the parental permission. Theoretically, I could have. It would qualify. If I was satisfied it was minimal risk, it would qualify for expedited review, but I said no. I think this needs to go to the full board because there are concerns. So and ultimately the board decided it was a minimal risk. Okay? So some studies may go to the full board even if they qualify for expedited review. Yeah, well, that example I gave about severely clinically depressed subjects. Yeah, I mean, they may be competent, but we'd probably say we want a full board to review that study, unless it's a very innocuous survey. I would say at most universities, the most vulnerable population are students. And so when I was at the University of Albany, we had guidelines on when research on students needed to come to the full IRB and when it didn't. But students are vulnerable. No, that's to say you can't. Yeah. It's just whether we want full board. But when we look at research involving students, even if you're submitting it as exempt, we look very carefully about sort of the undue influence and the power relationship between the faculty member and students. So we do look at that. We haven't gotten any yet. If we did, because we have an additional requirement, there's an additional regulatory requirement for a prisoner representative. We'd have to get one. If you're thinking of doing research in prisons, talk to us first. Because there are restrictions on what research you can do in prisons. Prisoners are the most vulnerable. So I am going to let you in on a secret. So one of the questions I get all the time, and what led to this talk, was people always say, what's the secret to getting research approved by the IRB? There must be a trick. And I'll say, well, because Dr. Smith submits his research and it gets approved immediately by the IRB, and I submit mine and it comes back and it goes back and forth and it takes forever to get approval. What's the trick? Normally, when people ask you that question about anything, you say, well, there's no secret. And, well, there is a secret. And there is a trick to getting your research approved by the IRB. And I'm going to tell you about it. I'm going to let you in on the secret. And it's not entirely altruistic about letting you in on the secret, because if you know the secret, our job is easier. So it's really designed to make our lives easier, because if you follow these simple rules, if you know the secret and you follow it, then when we get your protocol, when we get your research, we'll look at it and go, yep, that's fine, good, prove it. And that's all it'll take, theoretically. Okay, so what's the secret? The secret of getting research approved by the IRB is knowing what issues the IRB has to address before it can approve research, and giving them that information. Giving the IRB the information it needs to address before it can approve research. And one of the things I usually say when I'm talking to various audiences, give them the information whether they ask for it or not. And the reason that's the secret is because the IRB has marching orders. The IRB doesn't, now you may not know how the IRB works. And a lot of people see the IRB as this black hole. And we send something in, and then something pops out, and we have to do something, and nobody has any idea how the IRB works. Well, the regulations are very specific about how the IRB has to work. The regulations contain a section called the Criteria for IRB Approval for Research that has a list of issues that the IRB has to address every time it reviews a research study. Those are the marching orders of the IRB. So when we get your protocol, basically we sit with that list and we say, does it meet this criterion? Does it meet this criterion? Does it meet this criterion? And if you know what those criteria are and how they work, you give us that information, we're going to go, yes, 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 approved. That's it. That's the secret. So what are the criteria? So the regulations say, in order to approve research covered by these regulations, the IRB shall determine that all of the following requirements are satisfied. And here are the criteria. A summary. This is it. The risks to subjects are minimized. The risks are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. Informed consent is appropriately sought. Informed consent is appropriately documented. Now, the three over there on the right say when appropriate. They don't say optional. When it's appropriate to the research, they're also required. And after 40 years in this business, or almost 40 years, getting there, so it'll soon be 40 years. In May, it'll be 40 years. I believe that all three of those are always appropriate. Data collection is monitored to ensure subject safety. When is that not appropriate? When aren't you watching out for what's happening in the research to make sure the subjects are still safe? Privacy and confidentiality are protected. When's that not appropriate? And additional safeguards are included for vulnerable populations. You might say, oh, well, my research doesn't involve vulnerable populations. And the question is, how do you know? You have to look at who's going to be in your study to decide whether they're vulnerable, or any of them might be vulnerable, so you're addressing that criterion. So all 8 of those are, I believe, always required. And when we review research, we go through each one of those to determine whether we can approve your study. Now, this is where we get into this borderline between exempt and not exempt. So technically, all 8 of these do not necessarily have to apply to exempt research. You don't necessarily have to go through all of those things when we're looking at exempt research. But you'll see that, remember I said exempt research is not exempt from ethical issues, and those are ethical issues. And, but when it's not exempt, we do have to go through all those. Okay. Now, I saw most of you have taken the CITI program. And I've taken all those criteria for approval and I've put them in boxes, and now I'm going to put labels on those boxes. Does anybody know where the labels come from? Anybody? The Belmont report. These are the 3 Belmont principles. And the point behind this slide is these criteria for approval are the implementation of the Belmont principles. And they come directly from the Belmont principles. Okay? I once gave a talk like this on the criteria for approval to an IRB, and the IRB chair said to me, oh, that's bureaucratic nonsense, we do ethical review. My response is, if you're not addressing the criteria for approval, you're not doing ethical review. So under beneficence, we have the risk-benefit analysis. We have the data safety monitoring to make sure the subjects are safe. Now you'll notice the words in gray there. They don't appear in the criteria for approval. But under beneficence, we have the experimental design and the qualifications of the PI. Why is that under beneficence? Simple. Bad science can have no benefit. Bad science has no benefit. But the IRB is not a scientific merit review committee. We are not charged with looking at the scientific merit of your research. That's not our charge. Our charge is to ensure that the risks are reasonable in relation to the benefits, that the science is good enough to justify the risks. So we're not going to look at your study and say, oh, you need to, you're not getting enough power analysis, you need to modify, these questions might not get the right, that's not our job. Unless we feel that the science is not good enough to justify the risks. How good does the science have to be for minimal risk research? Not very good. Okay. That threshold of good enough is pretty low for minimal risk research. The more risky the research, the better the science should be, but our job is not to evaluate the science. That's why you have supervisors. That's why you have a university, and that's your job, to do good science. Our job is to make sure the science is good enough to justify the risks. So we come back to you about the science. It's always going to be in relation to the risks. Always. So under justice, we have the whole subject selection and recruitment. Under respect for persons, of course, informed consent, privacy and confidentiality, and additional protections for vulnerable populations. So we're going to go through each of these. Risk is the most misunderstood term in this whole field. Most people confuse risk and harm. Risk is not harm. Risk is the possibility of harm. Okay? Suppose I were, so risk requires two criteria. It's a two-dimensional term. In order to evaluate risk, you have to look at both the magnitude of the possible harm and the probability that that harm will occur. Suppose you're an IRB, and I'm submitting research to you, and I say that my research has the possibility of hair loss and death. What have I told you about the risks of that study? Nothing. Zero. All I've told you are possible harms. I've given you a list. How many people have seen those commercials on TV for drugs? And everybody's dancing through the fields of flowers, and everything's great. And then at the end, they run through, then this may cause your hair to fall out, your teeth to fall out, blah, 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 blah. That's a list of possible harms. It says nothing about the risk of taking that drug. And why? What haven't I told you? Well, I haven't told you either of those. I haven't told you about the magnitude. You might say, well, death. Okay? That's pretty serious. But it depends. Okay? It depends, for example, if this was a cancer study, that's different from a survey. If I'm going to give you a survey and there's a possibility of death, now that's serious. Okay? Hair loss. I haven't told you how much hair loss. Okay? So I have to give you the magnitude, but also the probability. So the probability, if I were to tell you the probability of death is 1 in a million, well, there's probably 1 in a million chance an asteroid's going to hit this building and kill us all. That's not a reasonable risk. Okay? But a 1 in 10 chance of death, that's a reasonable risk. Okay? Hair loss. What's the likelihood? So how much hair loss and what's the likelihood of the hair loss? Now, you also have to do this. Remember, this is risk-benefit analysis. You have to do this and you evaluate the risk in relation to the benefits. If this is an oncology study, you don't do oncology research, but if I were submitting an oncology study, a 1 in 10 chance of death, that may be a reasonable risk because that might be better odds than you're facing anyway. But I'm doing a psychology survey with a 1 in 10 chance of death? No, no way. Okay? The hair loss. Well, for a teenage girl, partial hair loss, slight hair loss might be really serious risk. Okay? But again, if that teenage girl's in an oncology study, sure. But she's not going to be in a psychology study with a chance of hair loss. So you always have to do it in relation. So what's the probability and the magnitude of the risk in relation to the benefits from the study? So that's what. So what I'm telling you, when I said this is the secret, you have to tell the IRB this information. So you have to decide for your research, what are the risks? What's the magnitude? What possible harms could occur in this research? What's the magnitude of those harms? And, what's the probability they're going to occur? Now, you don't know numbers. You don't know 1 in 10 or those kinds of numbers, but you know what's likely and not likely, what's likely and rare. Okay. So you have to think through in designing your research, how could subjects be harmed? How serious are those harms? And what's the likelihood those harms are going to occur? Does that make sense? So that's what you need to tell us. You need to tell us. As an IRB, what we have to do is identify the risks, determine that the risks are minimized, determine that the risks are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, and determine that the subjects are adequately informed about the risk in a way that they can understand it. Unfortunately, so your first job is to tell us. Fortunately, we can't rely on what you tell us. No offense, but human beings aren't capable of being totally objective about their own work. Two ways. One, we tend to overestimate the benefits of what we're doing, because that's why we do it. If we didn't think it was worth doing, we wouldn't do it. But they also, and this is a very fundamental issue, human nature issue, people tend to underestimate the risks of things they're very familiar with. The more familiar you are with something, the more you underestimate the risks, because your perspective changes. How many people here have flown recently? What was the most dangerous part of your trip? Driving to the airport. That's where you were at risk. Less so in the plane. I'll give you a perfect example for myself. I was living in New York City. I take a cab to the airport, got in the cab. 5 minutes after I got in the cab, we were in a fender bender. I hit the plastic behind the driver with my face, bit through my lip, banged my nose. Why did I hit the plastic with my face? Wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Why wasn't I wearing a seatbelt? Because I was underestimating the risk of that part of my trip. Oh, we just got in a cab, good deal. Right? So it was because I was so familiar with that part of my trip, less familiar with being in a plane. You wouldn't get in a plane and not wear a seatbelt. So people tend to, so if you're talking to kids every day, you're not in the best position to evaluate the risk of talking to kids. A brain surgeon who mucks around in people's brains every day is not in the best position to evaluate the risks of what she does. Okay? So we as an IRB have to do an independent evaluation of risk. Independent. We have to evaluate the risks ourselves. Now, that requires scientific expertise. So, for example, when I get studies from here, I'm in a good position because I'm a psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology. But there are areas where I say, no. So, for example, we recently had a study that involved children in the clinic. And so we said, okay, we want outside expertise. We want to send this. So we had it sent to a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist who does this to get that expert opinion on the risks. So it requires expertise. Now, important thing about social and psychological risks, they're real. Social and psychological risks, social and psychological harms are no less real than physical harm. In fact, my personal feeling, maybe because I'm a psychologist, I think they're more serious to people than physical harm. People recover from physical harms. Psychological harms are harder to recover. Okay? Social and psychological risks are very time and situation specific. So the best example I have of this is I had a colleague doing research on sexually transmitted diseases and she was doing the research on inner city young males. And her problem was, okay, not that they were not telling her the truth. The problem was they were telling her that they had sexually transmitted diseases when they didn't. Why? Because it seemed macho. They were sort of bragging about something that they really didn't have. That was that situation. That culture caused a false positive response. So not only were they not embarrassed, they were bragging. Now do that same study among, middle-class suburban males. Now you're talking about very sensitive information that could put people at risk. Do the same study amongst Catholic clergy. Now you're talking about life-destroying, career-destroying information. So when you're evaluating social and psychological risk, it's very time and situation specific. So you're looking at your study, what's the impact on the subjects? You have to look very carefully. Another thing I could add to that, there's another bullet that should be on the slide, but it's not. Social and psychological risks can be delayed. They don't immediately appear. Had a colleague, we were on a task force about social and psychological risk, and he said, something just occurred to me. He said, when I was an undergraduate, I participated in a social psych experiment, one where they embarrassed subjects and manipulated subjects. It was years ago, probably before IRBs. He said, I did the study, fine, no problem. Okay. A few months later, I started having panic attacks. I went for treatment, panic attacks went away. Now, in retrospect, it occurs to me that those panic attacks could have been related to the experiment. Because psychological effects can be delayed. You've got to think, number one, what psychological effects could be occurring in my research, and how am I going to tell if they're delayed? Psychological and social risks are very subjective. Who is the only person that can really evaluate how risky research is for them? The subject themselves. Only the subject. We could try, you could try as a researcher, we can try as an IRB, but only the subject really knows. And we'll talk in a second. The consent, that's why I think consent is more important in social and psychological research than it is in biomedical research. The consent in social psychological research should empower subjects to decide for themselves what the risks are. So it should be explained to them in a way they can understand it and apply it to their lives. Unfortunately, there's very little data on risk in social or psychological research. So you're going to have to use some judgment. You can't point, biomedical researchers can point to lists of symptoms and all kinds of stuff. You've got to use your judgment in identifying those risks. And here's just a list of possible psychological and social harms that can come from research. You've got to think through all the ramifications. And when you've done that, then clearly present that to the IRB. This is what I think the risks are. Sometimes just being in the study is a risk. Oh, excuse me. The primary risk in social behavioral research is breach of confidentiality. There are IRBs out there that I've dealt with that see a survey that's gathering very sensitive data even identifiable sensitive data, and immediately say that's a more than minimal risk study. But they're looking at the wrong thing. What's the risk in that study? Not that the investigator has that data. What's the risk? The data will get out. So when you're saying, okay, what's the probability of that harm? That could be a great harm. If this data got out, it could seriously harm subjects. So the magnitude is high. But what's the probability that that's going to occur? I was just involved with one of our clients' IRBs, and they got a proposal. The researchers were doing a massive data collection. They were hoping to collect from thousands of people all of the information about them, including financial information, health information, criminal record, everything. And the IRB's initial reaction was, oh, there's a lot of risk there. But the researchers had done an amazing job, and they had highest level IT consultants, and their protection, data protection, was greater than any bank, any university, any school, any hospital, greater than the government. So the likelihood, it wasn't zero, but the likelihood of a breach of confidentiality was so low, there's a minimal risk study. It didn't matter how sensitive the information was, it's what's the likelihood that that information is going to get out. Now, minimizing risk. First of all, if your study is a minimal risk study, risk doesn't have to be minimized. It already is. This is for more than minimal risk studies. So alternatives, other procedures that are less risky. For example, we had anybody remember type A versus type B personality? Back in the 80s, I think every dissertation and every thesis that came out of psychology was about type A versus type B. That was going to solve everything. We don't hear as much about it now because it didn't solve much at all. But back then it was a big deal. So we had a researcher come to us and wanted to watch people eating in a restaurant and count the number of bites per minute they took. And then as they were leaving the restaurant, he was going to have them fill out a personality inventory. And somehow he was going to correlate bites per minute with type A versus type B. I'm not going to get into the scientific merit of that study. But the IRB had a problem with it. And they said, you're invading people's privacy. The investigator said, no, a restaurant's a public space. I can look at whoever I want to look at. Okay? And one of the IRB members said to the investigator, suppose you were sitting in a restaurant and you looked over and I was staring at you and writing down everything you did. How would you feel? Okay? Most people would feel their privacy had been invaded, even though you're in a public space. Not everything that happens in public is public behavior. And we have privacy expectations. So the IRB said, you've got to change your design. So what he did was very interesting. He turned it into a lab experiment. He advertised for subjects to come in to be observed while they're filling out personality inventories. And then it said, oh, by the way, we'll give you lunch. And what he was watching, he was recording their bites per minute and correlating, but they knew they were being observed. So he wasn't invading their privacy. That's an alternative. Sometimes you got to think outside the box. Okay? Precautions are about things that decrease the likelihood that something's going to occur. we had a study that involved date rape, and it was very likely, okay, actually that's a contingency. The contingencies are about the magnitude. So what are you going to do if something happens? And so the study was about date rape. Everybody knew that reliving the experience would be a problem, could cause trauma. So not only did the researcher consult with the Women's Safety Task Force on campus, she also set up an arrangement with psych services at the university so that every time she interviewed a subject, she called psych services first and said, I'm interviewing a subject in this study. So they were prepared in case something happened. And indeed, several women did have emotional breakdowns. The researcher picked up the phone, called psych services. They were there in 5 minutes to counsel the person. And there were no long-lasting untoward occurrences. So she took action. She minimized the risk. Everybody see that? Okay, so risk-benefit. Okay, good. Yeah. Let me give you another example of that. We had a study where the researcher wanted to interview college students about normal child development. Wasn't interested in trauma or abuse. Went through expedited review, minimal risk, proved. Got a call from him. 3 of the first 5 subjects he interviewed had acute emotional breakdowns. So, sent the questions to child psychologists. Turns out the way the questions were written, there were triggers. If you'd had a traumatic experience as a child, it would trigger a reaction. So he did 2 things. Took out the triggers on the advice of the psychologist, and he screened. He said, when he advertised for the study, he said, if you'd had a traumatic experience as a child, you may not want to participate. He interviewed 100 more subjects and never had another child problem. So the things you can do to minimize the risks. Do we follow that? Recruitment. So, and actually, I'll tell you that this slide talks about equitable recruitment of subjects or selection of subjects. And that's what the regulations say. That's the term we use. I've been in this business 40 years. I'll tell you, nobody knows what that means. See all that gobbledygook up there? It's gobbledygook. In real life, when we're talking about justice, we're talking about minimizing or avoiding exploiting subjects, taking advantage of subjects because of their circumstances, because of their condition, and avoiding undue influence. So both of those things come into play. We had a question before about students. Okay. Using students as subjects. Both of those things. We're exploiting them, we're taking advantage of them, and there's undue influence. Instructor comes into a classroom, passes out a survey, and says, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Who in their right mind is going to say no? That's undue influence. So you've got to think about, am I being fair to these subjects? Am I being equitable? Am I exploiting these subjects? Am I taking advantage of them? Is there undue influence? Clinician asking patients. Okay, there's a thing called the therapeutic misperception. When a healthcare provider asks someone to do something, there's a tendency in most people to think, I better do this, or it's going to affect my care. Okay? So you have to be careful that they understand that it's voluntary. They understand that they don't have to do it. To get rid of that exploitation, Get rid of that undue influence as a healthcare provider, as a mental health provider. Then there has to be alternative ways. They have to be able to say, no, I don't want to do this. If you're using it for research, again, we talk about teaching versus research. If it's for teaching purposes, fine. But if you want to use it for research, it has to be voluntary. You have to figure out, how do I make it voluntary? So our university had a Psych 101 pool, and the students had to participate, had to fulfill a research participation requirement, X number of hours. But they had options. Being a research subject was only one of the options. They could, and the options had, a lot of places have options. Okay, you write a paper. That's not an option for a college student. So, you can do it as long as it's still voluntary. Recruitment. How subjects first hear about the research is part of the consent process. Recruitment should be clear. It should clearly state it's for research. It should clearly not be coercive or unduly enticing. What is unduly enticing when you're recruiting subjects? Money, college credit. Those things can be unduly enticing. Okay? You got to make sure clear it's for research. Okay, I could spend all day talking about informed consent. I'm not. We'll talk about it a little more this afternoon. One thing you got to know, it's not about the consent forms. The consent form is the least important part of the consent process. Consent is a process. It's a subject, it's a dialogue between the investigator and the subjects, how the subjects give their agreement to participate. It's a consent process. I hear people all the time saying, we found a typo on the consent. You can't have a typo in consent. It's a process. Where do you have a typo? On consent form. Okay, so it's a process. It's a dialogue. It requires full disclosure about the nature of the research and the subject's participation. It requires adequate comprehension on the part of the subjects and the subject's voluntary choice to participate. And the most important part of that is the second bullet. If subjects don't understand what they're agreeing to participate in, you do not have informed consent. What do subjects do when you, or what do people do when you tell them things they don't understand? They nod their head, they go, uh-huh. And you say, do you have any questions? What do they say? No. Does that mean they understood anything you said? No. Okay. Best example I have of this, I have a friend in New York. It's not a research example, but it illustrates. I have a friend in New York. He's Puerto Rican. His father's lived in New York City for 40 years. Okay. His father had a medical condition, asked his son to go with him to talk to the doctor. The doctor went through the whole thing about the medical condition and went through all the alternatives, treatment alternatives. And the doctor said, do you have any questions? And my friend's father said no. And the doctor said, okay, I'll leave you two alone to talk about it, and we'll come back and we'll come up with a treatment plan. The doctor walked out, and my friend's father turned to him and said, what did he say? Now, it wasn't a matter of, although English wasn't his native language, he spoke English well. But number one, it wasn't his native language. And number two, he was under stress. And number three, the doctor was rattling off medical jargon. He didn't understand a word that doctor said. Okay. And if his son hadn't been there, the doctor would have walked back in the room and the guy would have said, whatever you say, doc. So you have to make sure that the subjects really understand. In fact, doctors need to do that too. I just as an aside, it's got nothing to do with anything, but a few weeks ago attended a lecture by Alan Alda, the actor. And his latest thing, what he's doing now, is training scientists and doctors to communicate. Because what he discovered was that doctors can't communicate to people. So he teaches them improv so they can communicate. You have to make sure that the subjects understand what you're telling them. Now, I have investigators come to me and say, oh, I'm not a mind reader. How can I be sure? And I say, it's simple. Look them in the eye. When you tell someone stuff and they don't understand you, it's obvious. You can see it on their face. Okay? And then the other thing you can do is you ask them questions. Don't say, do you have any questions? If you don't understand, how can you ask questions? You ask them. You tell me what this research is about. Now you tell me what the risks are. And if they can't, you got to start over again. I think so, because we also have our own jargon, and often we're dealing with people who are in difficult situations. You have to make sure that they understand. They really understand what this is about. I mean, you can do it with a true-false test. You can just do it by asking them. We're going to ask you about, yes, you're going to submit to us a consent form, unless we waive that requirement, but we're going to ask you about the process. You need to tell us how you're doing this. Who's obtaining consent? How are you obtaining consent? How are you making sure the subjects understand, regardless of whether there's a consent form? Consent should empower the subjects to make their own choice and apply the research and determine for themselves what the risks are. So it needs to be explained to them in everyday language that they can understand. On the other hand, the consent process shouldn't do more harm than the research. There are studies where you're telling them everything. The research doesn't do any harm, but telling them what it's about could. Back in the day, I remember when I was in graduate school, it was a long time ago, there were all these social psych experiments done on physical attractiveness, how it affected various things, and they actually selected subjects based on their physical attractiveness. Now, you're not going to tell people that. What's the point of telling? You're doing more harm to people through the consent process, this idea that you have to tell them everything. So if you don't want to tell them everything, you can ask for a waiver. And the IRB will consider whether that's a reasonable basis for a waiver. Now, consent forms are not always required. Most minimal risk research in most minimal risk social behavioral research qualifies for a waiver of documentation of consent. So you can ask us, if your study's a minimal risk study, you can ask us for a waiver of a signed consent form. You can't decide to do that, but we can tell you you don't need a signed consent form. And there'll be times, Joyce will say, where you're sent in a consent form and we'll come back and say, no, you don't need that. So if you're doing minimal risk social behavioral research, you may not need a signed consent form. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I'm not a big fan of consent forms. I actually don't care what it says on a consent form. I don't think consent forms protect anyone. I don't think they protect the subjects because they don't read them. And I'm afraid to tell you this, but they don't protect you either because they don't hold up in court. Consent forms do not hold up in court. What holds up in court is a consent process. What holds up in court is making sure the subjects understand. It's not what it's on a piece of paper. Consent isn't a piece of paper. And just because you have someone's name on a piece of paper does not mean you have informed consent. It's about the process, not about the form. Okay, the safety monitoring, we're almost done. You can have lunch. Safety monitoring, it's oversight over the, so once you get IRB approval, once you start the research, you're not done. You have responsibilities as a researcher, and one of those is to monitor the data collection, monitor the research as it's ongoing to ensure subjects safe. Remember that interviews of about normal child development, the story I told you? When did he call the IRB? Remember? After how many subjects? After 3. When should he have called? After 1. Okay. Why didn't he call? Because he didn't have a safety monitoring plan. He didn't know what to do if something went wrong. The purpose of a safety monitoring plan is that you know what, you have a plan. Okay. If something happens even in innocuous research, if something happens that you didn't expect, you have a plan for what to do with that. And mostly, call the IRB. You can call us if you have a problem. Privacy and confidentiality, that's not one word. These are two concepts that actually have nothing to do with each other. Privacy is having control over access. That restaurant study, researcher was invading people's privacy even though they were in public. Okay. A big thing now is internet research. I don't know if anybody here is doing a lot of internet research. But internet researchers often say, oh, but I'm only observing public behavior. These chat rooms, the Facebook, all those Instagram, that's all public behavior. Well, not necessarily, even if it seems to be public. Suppose you're walking down the street and you're having a conversation with friends. And you know that the passersby on the street can overhear you. You know that. You're in public. You're having a conversation. Suppose you turn around and I'm following you and writing down everything you say. Would you consider that an invasion of privacy? Yes. Even though you're in public. We have expectations of privacy, reasonable expectations that we're not going to be observed, we're not being studied, we're not being systematically recorded. And so even things that happen in public can be an invasion of privacy. Confidentiality is after you've got the data, how do you protect it? We've already talked some about that. I'm going to quickly go through. Confidentiality and anonymity are not the same. I can tell you how many times I've heard a researcher say, this study is anonymous, only I will know your name. That's not anonymous. Now it deals with confidentiality, it's not anonymous. Anonymity means no one, even the researcher can't identify anyone. Names are not the only identifiers. People can be identified from demographics. So you have to ask the question, what's the likelihood that only one person meets these demographic criteria? Okay. There's only one person in this room who has gray hair and lives in upstate New York, and that's it. I'm it. So if you're gathering demographics, I can be identified from that data. So you got to think about beyond names, beyond social security numbers, how can people be identified? But it's always in relation to the risk, how sensitive the data is. You don't have to go to elaborate procedures for a minimal risk study. Gathering innocuous information, you don't have to go to a lot of depth. If you're gathering sensitive information, you have to do more. Okay, we've already talked about vulnerable populations. I'm just going to hit on it. We talked about there's 3 targeted groups in the regulations. But anything that makes someone interferes with someone's ability to process information, to make free decisions, anything that restricts their liberty, they're vulnerable. So that's it. That's the secret. So if you understand all of those factors and you go through this exercise with your research and you give us that information clearly about each of these areas, then your study is going to be approved without a problem. That's the secret.
I'll be introducing Joyce Plaza. Joyce is a certified IRB professional and has been working in IRB administration since 2006. She has a bachelor's degree in biology, a Master of Science degree in library and information science, and a Master of Bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to working in IRB administration at Columbia University in New York, she worked at the Columbia University Center for Bioethics, where she was responsible for the administration of the office, including applying for and managing federal grants for the responsible conduct of research. Along with the director of the center, she co-authored 2 federally funded online webinars on the topics of conflict of interest and privacy and confidentiality for research. She has experience as a member of both biomedical and social behavioral educational IRBs. At Columbia, she also was responsible for managing the Human Research Projection Office, IRB office, on the Morningside campus, which included the education and training of Columbia faculty, students, and staff. The Morningside HRPO IRB office is responsible for the administrative review of human studies in psychology, social work, political science, sociology, engineering, anthropology, education, and law. She currently works as an associate for the HRP Consulting Group, Biomedical Research Alliance of New York. Welcome.
Thank you. So just to give you some background, for the Brainy IRB, I actually play 2 roles. So I do the administrative work. If those of you that have submitted to the IRB, you would receive emails from me. I do sort of what we call a pre-review or the administrative review of the studies, making sure everything is there, asking questions, maybe asking you to submit more information. So I do the administrative role. But then I'm also a member of the IRB. So when we have a full board study, I also sit as a member of the committee and vote on the, the full board review. So just to give you an idea of what I'm doing. So based on my experience with the Albizu studies, as well as some tips that I have in general for investigators, I put together this PowerPoint with just sort of random thoughts and things about explaining some things to you. These are sort of like practical tips. Jeff went over, he did a great job of going through, the theory, the regulations, and the ethics of it. So I'm going to talk about some practical tips that might be helpful to you. And if you have a question as we go through this, please just stop me and ask, because this is really this is sort of the how-to practical part of it, and it'd be great for you to sort of think about it and ask questions. So just to give you, there is a link here for the actual regulations. If you, the Office of Human Research Protections of the federal government has a link, and they do have some FAQs. They have some guidance documents. So if you're doing, for example, research with children, research with prisoners, you might want to take a look at that link. And if you have a, electronic version of this, you can, access that link and see how that goes. So recommendation before you're submitting to the Brainy IRB is to take a look at the guidelines, which are actually on Blackboard, I understand here. Their title, I think, is the Albizu Brainy Guidelines, or the Brainy Albizu Guidelines. And that kind of goes through a list of things that you need to do or to think about and to submit. So there's a list of requirements for submission. There's the policies regarding study personnel, submitting translations, submitting changes. So once you're approved by the IRB, if you want to make a change to a study, you have to submit that change to the IRB prior to implementing that study. So our role is to just make sure that if it's a minimal risk study, that your changes, don't change that risk level. There's not, you may have to change your consent form if you want to make certain changes, what documents might have to be modified. So it's important that you understand that any kind of changes must be submitted. So there's a form for that. And if you have an expedited or full board study right now that has a expiration date, and you have to submit a continuing review before that expiration date, and actually Brady's policy is 30 days before, because you do not want your study's approval to lapse. So if you have a study that's expedited or full board, there's a date of approval and when it expires. It's put on your documents. And if you do expire and you haven't got your renewal or the next year's approval, you have to stop all research activity. And that includes analyzing identifiable data. So if you go back to the definition of what research is and what Jeff said this morning, if you are analyzing identifiable data, you're still conducting human subjects research. So you want to make sure that if you have, expedited or full board protocol, it should be obvious when you're approved that there is the expiration date is included in the letter that you receive. The consent forms have a stamp on them that shows when that consent expires. You have to submit to the IRB at least 30 days ahead of time so we have a chance to review for continuing that study if that's the case. Okay? So the point of this slide is to just sort of tell you that there's a place here at Albizu that has sort of the guidelines and descriptions and documents and things that you should check out. Again, you may know this already. I know previously this may not have been a policy, but right now the policy is that the PI must be a faculty member. Okay? So, Jeff went through, what is human research protection? What is human research? What is human subjects research? And sometimes you might be doing something and you're not sure whether it meets that definition of human subjects research. So if you're not sure, there is a document to be submitted that's contained in the guidelines, and it's called the Brainy SBER IRB Submission Form 101, Request for Human Subject Research Determination. So this is a form that you could submit when you think you might be doing a project, but it doesn't meet that definition of human subjects, and you can submit this document there. That's the purpose of that document. Now, I put here a link. Let's see if I can open this up. It's not loading here. Oh, yep, it did. This is a link that you might find very useful. This is put out by the federal government, and this is what we call the decision chart. This is like a flow chart to decide whether or not is the activity, I don't know, okay, let me go back here. See, chart number 1, is the activity research involving human subjects? I would recommend that you sort of become familiar with this link in this chart, because if you're sort of struggling with, geez, am I doing human subjects research or not? Might it be exempt? You can start here. This chart here says start here, and then you start asking questions. Is it research? So it has the definition of what research is. Activity, a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So if you say no, then you come down here, and it should say, you have to check other federal regulations, and then so on. Go to chart 2. So you can follow this flow chart. It looks kind of condensed, but this is really an easy way to kind of decide whether or not you're doing human subjects research. See, does the research involve obtaining information about living individuals? No, you go this way. Yes, you go this way, and you continue. Then what the decision chart can do for you is also then help you. If you say, yes, I am doing human subjects research, the next question is it exempt? So charts 1 and 2 on this link is probably really helpful to have, I would say. So you can take a look at that. See if I can get back to, okay, good. So these are the categories that Jeff went into, and again, to qualify for exempt, there's little or no risk, and it has to meet the categories that are defined by the federal government. If it's expedited, no more than minimal risks, and only, again, it meets the definition of the various categories of expedited research. And then anything that doesn't fit in those categories, that is human subjects research, requires full board review. So, then there's a form on those Brainy Albizu guidelines that you have here on campus for requests for exempt determination. So if you think, well, this might be exempt, you can submit this form. And also you need to submit the items required, because for exempt studies, for example, we want to make sure you have the training that is required for human subjects research. We need to know who are the study personnel involved. There's a study personnel form. And also, even though exempt research doesn't have to fit all of the regulations, we do expect that it will have informed consent. Now, the trick is signatures for the consent are not required for exempt studies. So it's up to you whether or not you want a signature or not. Lots of people are doing online surveys, and it really doesn't make sense to have if they're exempt, there's no need to consider whether or not, that you need a signed consent form. So it makes it easy to do those. So here's some of the list of the things that are needed for submitting to the IRB, the personnel form. There's a personnel form that we need, all the names of the key personnel. Students are typically the co-investigators, or they might be research assistants, the faculty members, the PI. The CV of the principal investigator and the co-I. And you must complete the city human subjects research training for all key study personnel. Now, sometimes I get certificates of city training for different training, not the human subjects research training. There's one on, what's it called, information, PSI or something. It's about data. That is not the requirement for the Brainy IRB. It has to be the human subject research training, okay? And there are actually two versions of it. There's a social behavioral version, and then there's a biomedical version. It's up to you what kind of studies you do, which one you take, but it must be the human subject research training. And then there's a Form 3 that is the individual investigator agreement, which is a sort of a long list that you sign. All this key study personnel, so the PI obviously and the co-I sign this. And if you read through that, hopefully you do, if you're signing it, you're responsible for understanding the Belmont report, with the ethical principles that Jeff talked about, what your responsibilities are and so on. Sometimes Albizu researchers want to use somebody who is not an Albizu affiliate, not a student or an employee or whatever the case is. So each Albizu is responsible for any Albizu research, okay? And so if you have somebody from another who is not part of Albizu, then it's required to get permission for that person to participate in the Albizu research, okay? And I believe, Steve, you are the one that, okays that. Then that Form 3, the individual investigator agreement, has to also be signed, we say, by the institutional official, and in this case it would be Steve Proctor. So he has to sort of look at, well, who is this person? Some institutions would ask, well, why are you having somebody who's unaffiliated? They also have to do the training, okay? So there's a lot of little details that are important for you to know about, practical things that have to be done to submit to the IRB. And then everybody who's key personnel, that is everybody who's involved in the research, in consenting subjects or responsible for the design of the research, have to also sign a conflict of interest statement, okay? Which means you don't have any conflict of interest with that particular study. Like you're not getting paid by someone to do a certain kind of study that might benefit that particular organization, Most social behavioral studies don't have a conflict of interest. In the biomedical field, it's more common, particularly with drug studies and studies that are, sponsored or funded by drug companies. Okay, so in your initial submission, that is, let's say, for exempt studies or for expedited or full board, not for things that may not be human subjects research, okay? You have an IRB Form 1, you have consents or assents if you have minors, any subject-facing material. So what that means is that if you're giving subjects something, if you're asking them questions, if you're giving them directions, if you're reading to them, all that material has to be reviewed by the IRB, including recruitment. And as Jeff said, the recruitment is actually the beginning of your consent process, because what you're putting out there is you're putting out a statement is, I'm running a study, I need volunteers, and the study is about this, and whatever else you include. So that's really the beginning of the informed consent process. Any data collection tools that you're used could be, surveys, questionnaires, spreadsheets, whatever. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. So there's no clear, the co-investigator and the principal investigator are responsible and are definitely need to submit the forms. Key study personnel, Brainy defines that as anybody who is consenting subjects or responsible, they say, for the conduct of the study. I don't know what Albizu has done in the past with what, like, say, research assistants, what research assistants do. So it's I'm going by that Brainy definition, but you might have somebody on the study that doesn't fit that, but still on the study for some reason. Then you have to explain what their role is for us to make a decision how much information we need. But everybody should have the training, if somebody's on the study. Now, occasionally somebody might have a assistant on the study who technically is not engaged in the research. In other words, they're not consenting subjects, they're not interacting with subjects, and they're not seeing identifiable data. That possibly could be somebody who wouldn't need, to have training and all of that. So it depends. But in most cases, your key personnel, research assistants could be key personnel. All right. Yeah. (102) is the exempt one, isn't it, I believe? Isn't that for, I think that's the exempt study? So, again, it depends. Sorry. So, I think you have to use your best judgment to figure out, like, what are you doing? For exempt, typically we do get the Form 1, which is like the proposal. Yeah, unless it's very clear. See, I have had somebody submit an exempt on just the exempt form, and it was so clear what it was. I didn't need, the rest of it. So I know that's not a clear answer. Now, I do have a possible solution to that, which I'll talk about at the end, because I'm going to do a little demonstration of the Brainy database that in the future, we hope that you'll be submitting directly into a database, and that would eliminate any of this confusion about what forms and so on. So I'll talk about that at the end, okay? So one of the things that I always recommend to any researcher is that, keep in mind, you're writing your proposal to explain to me and Jeff and board members like what you're doing. It does not have to be your PhD dissertation. Sometimes we get pages and pages of, well, this in this literature it says that, and in that literature it says this. Well, that's up to your committee or your PI, your supervisor, what that is. Tell us as straightforward as you can. What are you doing? And now what we have to decide. We know we have to know about the risks. We know we have benefits. But the Form 1 that Albizu does break that down. How are you consenting? What are the confidentiality procedures? That's the information we want. You don't have to elaborate it. You don't have to make it complex. And it's very easy for an investigator who knows what they're doing to write and not really write clear enough to tell somebody else who has no idea what they're doing, and describe it, okay? So you can just be clear and straightforward about, what's going to be in your proposal for the IRB. Does that make sense? You know? Okay. Here's another helpful hint. When you're submitting documents, I need a file name that just doesn't say IRB submission. So there's got to be a way to identify it. You can put the PI's name. Actually, what would be most helpful is to put your title in the documents you're submitting and then the date. Because what happens, I am getting multiple protocols or studies from the same PI, different students. So it'd be helpful if I had the date you're submitting that, because if you have to submit a revision and you name the revision with the same name as the file, then it kind of can get confusing as to like what is the most recent one. So please date it and put the name of the title in. That would be really helpful. All right, the consent process. You learned this morning, the consent process is the important part, not the consent form. Your Albizu Form 101, Section 8, that's where you describe the consent process. And that's in addition to the consent form. So if you are, you can describe it in there, and if you are, some people have a verbal consent process as well as a consent form, you want to attach a copy of the verbal. Anything you say to, give to, read to, give to subjects, we need to see it and review. And also it's important that consent processes, subjects should be provided time to decide whether or not to participate. Now obviously if you're doing an online survey, and it's anonymous and you put it out there, people can decide on their own, they can read through it. But if you're doing a expedited study or a full board study where people may need some time to decide because you're presenting them with a lot of information, you have to allow for that and describe to us, how are you consenting? What is the process? Who is doing the consenting? Is sometimes are you giving them the consent information and then the next day they come in and they can decide, they decide whether or not to be in the study? I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm saying it's important that subjects really, this is the respect for persons part of the ethics, is people should be able to decide and have enough information to make a conscious decision about participating in the research. Consent form. Does it describe what you're doing in simple language? Okay. Is it consistent with your study procedure? So it's not uncommon for me to get an Albizu study that tells me, there's no risk, I'm doing this, and then all of a sudden have this consent form that comes out and tells me, if I have to report you according, to the authorities because of this and that, and I have to figure out, how can you report someone if you have anonymous data? For example, if you're telling them that you're going to report them if you find out that they're going to harm themselves or they're going to harm somebody else, and yet you don't even know who they are. So I'm like, how does that work? So your consent form should be consistent for what you're doing. I mean, it's pretty logical and simple, but I know that in your mind, you want to get this IRB protocol done, you want to get it written, you want to get it approved, you got to do your project, you got to do your dissertation, like you're thinking that, and you're not necessarily thinking about, what the document is telling us or what it's telling your subject. Simplify, 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 simplify. Sometimes, I think that it's very easy for investigators to assume that the regulations say I have to put all this in my consent form, okay? But they don't say that you have to have professional jargon, acronyms, complex sentences. So is there a way that you can simplify your sentences in your vocabulary, okay? When you include acronyms either in the consent or in your study description, I may not know what those acronyms are. The subject may not know what it is. So at least the first time that you use an acronym, you should spell it out. And maybe you should just spell, for a subject, you should spell it out all the time. There are lots of acronyms that your profession may use that may not be common knowledge. So that's important. And include a statement as to whether the subject is receiving direct benefit. Okay? Subject does not have to receive direct benefit, but it could be as simple as saying, you will not receive direct benefit. However, we will learn how individuals process A, B, or C. Okay? And, unless you're prepared and you're using minors in your study, you should have a statement that subjects must be 18 years of age or whatever the age of majority is in which you're conducting the research, if it's possible that you'll have underage, individuals. So if you are using students, I do always request that you add a statement that you must be 18 years of age, just in case an undergraduate is not quite 18 years old. Okay? Now, I know that there's been a study submitted for Puerto Rico, and I understand that Puerto Rico age of majority is 21. So that had to be changed in the consent form when they were going to be doing the study in Puerto Rico. So you can see that. You can find out what the age majority is in different states if that's relevant to your study by doing a search in the internet. I'm not going to go through all these, but these are what the regulations say have to be in a consent form. That it involves research, the purpose of the research, the expected duration, what the procedures are, any foreseen risks, and so on. And so this goes on and on. It's a statement describing the extent to which confidential records identifying the subject will be maintained, and then so on. So there are specific items that the regulations require being included, and there has to be a statement that it's voluntary, okay? Research is always voluntary. And when I've done training, I tell students and faculty, no one has to be in your research. Okay? No one has to be in your research. People get to make the decision about whether to be a subject, and so it is voluntary. And so that's an important piece of the ethics of that. So these are all sort of additional items that are required, if appropriate, in the consent form there. So the standard nationally is that consent forms be written at an 8th grade reading level. I have never seen one written at an 8th grade reading level, This is kind of like some of the things that Jeff talked about, like, it's there. That's not a regulatory, requirement. It's sort of a standard recommendation, okay? But I do think that it is a goal in mind, if it helps you to remember that the regulations do specify that the information must be conveyed in a language understandable those being asked to participate. Okay. You can simplify your consent form. You can just shorten the sentences. You can use, simple language. You don't have to use complex sentences and so on, right? Keep in mind, again, that you're writing the consent for individuals who are not researchers, okay? And that currently you do have an Albizu consent template, and I probably would recommend some changes to that. And one is, everyone seems to be saying this risk in this study is deemed minimal. There's nothing wrong with that. That's, there's not against regulations, but I don't know why you can't say risk in this study is minimal. Just say risk is minimal. Sometimes if it is appropriate, people say there is very little risk to this study. It's okay to say that, okay? If you're wrong when you submit it to the IRB, we will let you know. I mean, So here's another one that is in the Albizu consent form template that I refer to. Any information obtained in connection with the study will remain confidential, will be disclosed only with your permission or as required by U.S. or state law. When the results of this research are published or discussed, no information will be included that would reveal your identity unless your specific consent for this activity is obtained. Well, that is only relevant if you know who the people are, if you have identifiers, if you can go back to them and ask them. But if you are not collecting identifiers and you don't know, I don't know how you would report someone based on the law. Obviously, there is a law in Florida, yes, the Baker Law, I believed, and that makes sense, but lots of studies that are anonymous, minimal risk, not collecting identifiers are coming across with this text in it, okay? So that's what I'm saying, you can take a look, and even though you have a template that has some language, and it doesn't mean that it's relevant to your study. So you can read through that. Here's the other one that I was concerned about. I have read, or someone has read to me this form. Well, if a subject can't read English, okay, or is illiterate or speaks a different language. The regulations have additional requirements, so it's not a it's not a simple process of just reading the consent form to them. You can do an oral presentation of the informed consent, okay, but you also have to have a witness present, okay, and you have to have a written summary of what was presented, and the witness signs the oral presentation, and the subject has to be given copies of the summary and a short form. The short form, and there are examples of that just says, yes, this consent has been explained to me, and so on. So it's more than just, oh, I'm going to read the consent form to them. Okay. So unless that's required for your subject, for which you have to, describe and identify, then take that out of the consent form. Okay, research with children. So parental permission and assent of the child is required. Okay, so lots of times people will submit a assent form that's a little simpler than the than an adult consent form, but sometimes people might be using multiple ages in their studies. We say the consent form should be cognitively appropriate. So if you have a 5-year-old, obviously you're not going to have a consent form, okay? But even a 10-year-old might need a different kind of consent form from a 15-year-old, okay? So some studies, if they're using sort of a range of age of children, might need a couple assent forms. They need one appropriate for a 10-year-old and one appropriate for a 15-year-old, whatever the case may be. So you have to think, if you're using children in your study, you need to be aware of the fact that what age children are you using, what's appropriate for them, and so on. The child assent form is not required to have all the requirements of consent, okay? Again, it goes to what is cognitively appropriate for that child. One of the things that often happens in studies with children is you need to get permission from the parent for the child to be in the study. But at the same time, the parents end up being subjects, because you're asking the child maybe questions about themselves. So for example, if you have a study where let's say you are researching autistic children, you might go to the parent, you get permission to use the autistic children in the study, but you also may want to know about the history of the parent. Have they ever been diagnosed as autistic? And so on. You can combine the permission with a consent form, but you are also consenting parents. So it's actually parents could be providing permission, but they could also be subjects, in which case you need to consent them. So sometimes researchers sort of get permission from parents and forget that they're also getting data from the parents and that they could be subjects there. Research for minors, again, which we talked about this, depends on local law, and considering if you're using undergraduates, they should be informed that they have to be 18. So we talked about this. Okay, maybe you want to record, somebody in your study. Videotape hasn't been used for a long time, okay? So if you're saying I'm videotaping you might want to consider, say, video recording, okay, or audio tape. I don't know if anybody really uses tape anymore, but just to be up to date, just be aware of that you could be audio or video recording or taking photographs of subjects, okay? And you need to add that to your consent form. And in addition, you need to provide information about what the conditions are, like what will happen to that recording. Are you keeping that recording for the length of the study? Are you going to only be keeping a recording until it's transcribed and you're going to destroy the recording? And how it will be stored when the recording still exists, okay? Is the recording a requirement to participate in the study, or is it optional? It's up to you. You do what you want, but you need to be clear about getting consent for recording, and you can include that in the consent form as part of the procedures, okay? Or you can have a separate consent for the recording. Now, if everybody in the study is going to be recorded, I don't know why you need a separate consent. You can include it all if everybody's doing that. Sometimes it's optional, and therefore if someone is going to be recorded, and it's an option. You'd have a separate consent form there. Maintaining confidentiality. So I sometimes refer to this as soup to nuts. Sometimes people only tell us about confidentiality when they're collecting the data. But really, the IRB needs to know, what are you doing with the data when you collect it all the way to the end of your study and it's destroyed? Are you transferring the data? For example, you're out there recording somebody, and then you're carrying your computer into the office and so on, and it's maybe sensitive data so what are all the methods and practices from the start of collecting the data, storing the data, transferring the data, to the destruction of the data, and your confidentiality procedures? Confidentiality should be clear and easy. So it should be clear if you're coding the data, if you're collecting identifiable data, and if the code you're using is identifiable. So sometimes people use a code in which there are no identifiers, subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, but they have no idea who they are. Sometimes they keep a code separate that identifies who those subjects are. I mean, I don't know, which you're doing, but it should be clear to the IRB as well as to the subject, just exactly what are you doing. Keep it simple and clear. Privacy. So Jeff touched on privacy this morning. The IRB form should also include a description of your privacy procedures if it applies in your case. So how would privacy work in your description? For example, do your subjects have to be interviewed or surveyed in a private location? Are you doing some sort of sensitive interview or sensitive survey, and you're doing it one-on-one with your subject, and it's in a location that is private? Okay. Are subjects informed that they can skip any questions that they might find sensitive? And so privacy is, again, a different topic than confidentiality, and we need to know both. We talked about subject-facing screening. So lots of people only want to include subjects that have a certain eligibility requirements, okay, and they do screening. It's possible that the screening you do, for example, you're going to ask people questions. If you're screening and you're collecting data, you're interacting with somebody and collecting data, that already is considered human subjects research. So you might need a consent for the screening process, in addition for your consent for the study. Okay. Now, it could be a minimized consent. It doesn't necessarily have to be, depending on what you're doing. And so if you're collecting that data for the screening, the question is, are you keeping that data? And are you keeping that data if individuals are not eligible for your study? So if you are screening and you're sort of collecting data and you have people that are not eligible and you're maintaining that data, then those people need to be informed that that's what you're doing. Okay. So what are you doing during screening? Are you maintaining that data? And so on. So Jeff mentioned a waiver or alteration of consent. And I wanted to hopefully clarify for you what those are. So a waiver of consent, you can actually, the IRB can give you approval to waive getting a signature on the consent form. Now, this is separate from, this is not about an exempt study. This is about expedited and full board studies where consent is necessary, okay? So there are specific situations when the IRB can waive you getting a signature on the consent form, and this is only true for minimal risk studies. There is a form, the Brainy SBER IRB request for waiver or alteration of informed consent. So requiring a signature for expedited full boards may not be necessary, and this is really an important feature when you want to protect the identity of your subjects. The only record, this is approvable, if the only record linking the subject would be the consent, and the risk would be potential harm from a breach of confidentiality. So suppose you're asking someone about illegal activities, okay? And, you're not collecting their identifiers when you're interviewing them, but you have a consent form. And that consent form could link them to the study about illegal activities. You can request waiving getting that consent. And according to the regulations, it would be approvable, that the IRB would waive getting that documentation to protect the identities of the subjects, okay? There's another situation where you can waive consent, and that is if, number one, the research is no more than minimal, it would not affect the rights of the subject, okay? The study could not be practically carried out without the waiver, and whenever appropriate, subjects could be provided with additional information. So if you're doing an online survey, for example, and it's an expedited study, perhaps, all right, the IRB will need to waive you getting a signature if it meets those determinations, those requirements there. Okay, and now this information about when it's okay or not okay or whatever is actually on that document if you request a waiver of getting of documentation consent. The other situation where you can waive getting a signature is that if it's minimal risk and that there's no risk to subjects in what you're doing that would normally require a consent form. So again, using an online study when would be unreasonable to get a signature, and you're doing something that people don't normally have to give consent forms. So there are ways in which the IRB can waive getting consent, but the IRB for exempt and full board studies has to document in our findings, according to those regulations, that this is what's going on, okay? So, it's good for you to know that this is possible. If you get, there is a waiver form on the guidelines on Blackboard or Ask, and you can start checking off the reasons or how it fits into the regulations, but just know that it's possible that we can waive, getting a signature on the consent form. Now, sometimes people like to use deception or what we call non-disclosure. Let's suppose they're doing a study. Psychologists like to do this. They're doing a study, but they don't want to tell people what the study is about. Like, for example, the study is about lying, but I don't want to tell the subjects because I want to see if I can detect if they're lying, okay? So you can leave out the requirement to inform the subject about what the study is about by asking the IRB to waive that particular consent requirement, okay? So if you're not fully informing subjects or deliberately deceiving them, okay, we can, and you provide a justification, like for me to do this study online, I have to do it, it has to be done. And if it's minimal risk and necessary to conduct the study, then the IRB can approve waiving one of the requirements or two of the requirements for the consent process. Typically, after the study, a lot of psychology studies that use deception or something like that, they actually then do a debriefing afterwards, okay? I have had boards actually waive the debriefing process if they thought the debriefing would cause more harm than if you debriefed, okay? So some psychology studies, for example, would use Confederates, They'll do a study and they'll tell a student, like, okay, we're in the lab and another student's going to come and you're going to play a game, we're going to see who wins, or whatever the case is. But that actual other person is a Confederate, is one of the research assistants who is going to have all the answers to the questions, and the subject doesn't know that that's a Confederate. So that would be a case in which we have to waive fully informing the subject about the procedures and what the study's about. Then afterwards, they could do a debriefing and say, well, that person that you were playing that game with, well, that person was a research assistant and was a Confederate, was not just another subject. So as long as it's minimal risk, okay, it's possible to get those waivers and alterations. Sometimes you're going to use people who speak another language. Okay, the IRB approves everything in English first. Don't send us translations initially. After approval, okay, you will get in your approval letter that will ask for the translations. Okay, that's because we could drive you crazy if we had to ask you to change things, and then you'd have to change the English version and then all the translated versions. So don't do it. Just send us the English stuff. We'll approve it. Okay. Then, when you get it, we ask you for the translations. If it's a minimal risk study, which would be item number 1, we want to know who translated it. Okay, what are the credentials of the person who's translated? Maybe the investigator themselves is a native speaker. Or, sometimes in simple things we get, oh, I had 2 years of Spanish in high school or something like that. I mean, if it's a real simple study, it might be fine, okay? In addition, we need a statement, which is in red there. And that is also listed in the guidelines, the Albizu-Brainy guidelines. It's a statement from the translator that says the translations are consistent in content, style, and level of readability with the IRB approved document. That statement is in your guidelines. You can just, copy that. It's pretty simple, but you need to know. Obviously, if we're looking at informed consent and somebody's translating a document, we have to know that, yes, this translation is the same as the approved document, Now, if it's a greater than minimal risk study, then we do need a certified translation. Some of you may have had experience with that, where you actually have you probably have to pay for that, have a certified translator, and a certificate comes with that there. Another tricky part is secondary use of research data. So maybe a lot of people seem to be working with the University of Miami, okay, and maybe you're involved in a study there, but then you want to use the data collected for your Albizu dissertation. So now Albizu is responsible for that research that you're doing for your dissertation with data already collected. Okay, it's secondary data. And you need to get permission, you may need to get permission from the PI at University of Miami or wherever to use the data, okay? And again, we need like a signed letter or at least an email directly from the PI that it's okay. I mean, that's his or her data. It might be owned by University of Miami, so University of Miami might have, rules and regulations about using their research data for your research, okay? Again, each institution is responsible for their own affiliates, okay? So you need a letter giving you permission, and then we need to know, are you getting identifiers from that other study or not, okay? Many times you're not getting identifiers, and it's a pretty simple process where we just want to know from the PI that you're not, specifically, you're not getting identifiers, and you will never get identifiers in the future. In other words, they need to know that they're not sending you identifiers. We need to know. It may be possible at times where you might look at de-identified data, and then you might discover something really interesting, and then you might want to go back to the PI and say, hey, can you identify those subjects, subjects 1 through 30 for me, and get identifiers. So we want to be clear, what is the conditions under which your study is taking place. And if you are getting identifiable data, we want to know, okay, you're getting identifiable data from the University of Miami, and you're bringing it to Albizu or onto your laptop or whatever the case. How is it being protected? What are the confidentiality procedures? Soup to nuts, beginning to end. I'm getting it in my, University of Miami, and I'm putting it on a flash drive, or I'm putting on an encrypted flash drive, hopefully, and I'm bringing it to my laptop on campus or my laptop on home or whatever the case may be. So we sort of really need to know the details. And if you're using unidentified data for your dissertation, then it might not be human subjects research, but it should be submitted to the IRB with this documentation, and you can ask for a human subjects research determination. Publicly available data. So sometimes they get a link with people, and that's fine. That's good. I do want the links because I will get on the links and I will check out the data you're getting and to see that it is identifiable or not. It is publicly available, okay? But if the data set you're using is not available to the general public, maybe you have to pay money for it. Maybe you have to have a license to get it. Maybe you have to fill out a confidentiality. In other words, Joe Public can't get on and just pull down the data, then it's not publicly available. It doesn't mean you can't use it. I'm just saying that word publicly available gets used sort of loosely, and we want to make sure, what kind of data are we talking about? The U.S. Census and the CDC actually, has a lot of publicly available data that you can use. It spells out it's not identifiable and it's not human subjects research, so it's obvious, okay? So if you're submitting to the IRB, I do want to see the URL and explain, do you have to have a data use agreement, a license, or any other conditions in which to obtain the data, okay? because then it's not publicly available. But I will tell you, U.S. Census data is publicly available, and use of such does not require the IRB. Yeah. It all goes back to, does it meet the definition of human subjects research? We kind of always go back to there. We go back to that, and then is it available to anybody to get it, or do you have to have, sometimes you have to sign a data use agreement, for it, and then we go through the IRB. So does that answer your question? So. Oh, I see. Well, did you, you should, the issue is, what did you let your subjects, is it identifiable or not identifiable? You mean, if it's not identifiable, then it's not human subjects research. The question is, if you're going to use the data, for something else, the subjects should be informed. They need to be informed about what you're doing. Does that make sense? Okay. As much as, it's easy to resist, what's human subjects research? But really, going back to those definitions can really help inform you, and then maybe using those flowcharts to just kind of figure out, well, where am I, Okay, involving other institutions, we've covered this a little bit. This is also part of the Albizu guidelines there. Again, Albizu is responsible for you, whether you're doing research here, whether you're doing research at University of Miami, whether you're doing research at the mall, the Dolphin Mall, or whatever down the street. They're responsible for you, okay? Now, each institution is responsible for their affiliates. Many things can happen, possible scenarios, and some of them are spelled out in the Brainy Albizu guidelines. It's possible that if you're at University of Miami and doing research, and the University of Miami IRB agrees to cover you for that research, then an agreement, a formal agreement, is called an institutional assurance agreement between University of Miami and Albizu has to be signed. There's a template, and it has to be signed by both institutions. Yes, Joe Public is going to be on a Miami study, and this is the name of the study, and this is the name of PI, and yes, we, the University of Miami IRB, will cover that Albizu student, and then Albizu has to be notified that you're doing that study, and they also have to sign it. So both institutions have to sign it. And it has to be, according to regulation, the institutional official. So there's somebody here at Albizu who has signed with the federal government officially who is responsible for the human subjects research. And that person has to sign it, as well as University of Miami. So usually the IRBs are familiar with this, and I've had emails with IRBs from other institutions to sort of iron out, what's happening here, okay? So the idea is, just because you're doing research at another institution doesn't mean that you don't have to notify Albizu or Brainy, okay? And again, if you are using somebody not affiliated with Albizu, here you have to get permission from Steve Proctor, and he has to sign their individual investigator agreement along with them, and they have to do the training. They have to abide by all the Albizu rules for human subjects research. So Jeff commented on this a little bit, and we were talking about this at lunch. Human subjects do not include organizations or businesses. Okay, so if you wanted to do a study or project about, let's say, IBM. I guess IBM still exists. Do they still exist? I don't know. See, so, but you wanted to know only about the organization and the institution itself. You didn't want to know about anybody, their employees, or you didn't want the opinions of the employees. Then if you're going to an institution and you're interviewing, let's say, administration, and you're asking them, so what does IBM do about sexual harassment? What are your policies about sexual harassment? As long as you're not asking an individual about their opinion of the sexual harassment policies at IBM, then you're not doing human subjects research. So in other words, if you're only surveying, interviewing somebody, and all of your questions are only about a business or an organization, that's not human subjects research. As soon as you ask someone their opinion of their policies, then you've crossed the line. You're getting individual information. Is that clear there? And yes, people will say to me, well, I might start out asking about, IBM's sexual harassment policy, and then I might get into asking someone about their opinion. Well, then, there's a couple scenarios. If you think you might do that, then you apply the IRB, or if you find yourself doing that, you come back. If you didn't apply the IRB, come back to the IRB and say, okay, I was interviewing about the organization. Now I want to go back and ask about their opinions, individuals' opinions about that policy at that organization. Okay. Ready to submit. Proofread. Pretty simple. Please proofread your study and make sure that your documents don't conflict, because I do get studies where someone tells me I'm just doing A here in my consent form, and then, or actually I'm going to reverse it. They're going to tell me I'm only doing A as a procedure in the description of my protocol, and the consent form that has B, C, and D in there, and I'm like, okay, so which one are you doing? So I'm going to look, does your stuff make sense? Okay, it's pretty simple. It's a very simple way of saying it, and proofread it. Sometimes I've had people who have sent their study to someone to overlook, and somebody makes comments, and I get those comments in the submission, and I go, okay, what does that mean, Because I'm going to look at it as it's meaningful to me or meaningful to the IRB. So please take a look. You have any typos, extraneous text, spell out your acronyms. Even the IRB may not be familiar with your acronyms. And make sure you describe how you're conducting your procedures. For example, if you say, I'm going to monitor the subject's discomfort. Okay, so how are you going to do that? If you're doing an online survey and you say you're going to monitor their discomfort, I'm going to ask you how you're doing that. Okay? Now, if you get some response from me and I ask you to do certain things, so when you resubmit the revisions and clarifications, make sure, again, if you had to change something in your consent form, does your description of your study also have to be revised? Sometimes a change here can affect a change over there, so you want to make sure you do that. Also, you may need to, when you're revising any document, you may need to revise your protocol description or other documents. Do not submit documents that contradict. That's pretty simple. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit to some people about the stamping. So when you are approved, the Brainy database will stamp all your consent forms and any document used with subjects, as well as your protocol. Because what that means is that was approved by the IRB. So you are responsible to make sure, if you have sent me a couple versions, that you're using the stamped version that was approved. You're not using, let's say, the version that you originally submitted. Listen, it's very easy to get your documents mixed up. I do it all the time, That's why I ask you to please date your documents so that when I stamp it and you get it back, it should make sense to you. Oh yeah, that's my latest revision, and this is what's approved, okay? It doesn't mean that you, other than the consent form, which Brainy does require that you use the stamped consent form that was approved, the other documents don't have to have the Brainy consent, okay? The Brainy stamp. So sometimes I know I've done some, adjustments on, you sent me, after I stamp something, the Brainy stamp could cover over some text, and we've had to wiggle the text and let room for the Brainy stamp. But know that other than the Brainy approved stamped consent form, the other documents, you don't have to use the actual stamped version. You can, as long as you're using that version that was approved by the IRB. Hopefully that will simplify things for you, okay? If it's an exempt study, it doesn't say approved, it just says Brainy stamp, and it has a date on it. It doesn't, because we technically don't approve exempt things. This is the stamp that's on the bottom of the consent form. and it will have the system. It's actually the database will actually include those stamps. So on the bottom of your consent forms for expedited and full board protocols, you will see that stamp with the dates. The database actually puts the dates in there. Okay. Any questions on that? Or? Okay. So you're all done. You're all approved, and you have your study, and it will have an end date when you expire. So, for example, the consent form will say IRB approved with the date that it's stamped through, and it will have the end date. Okay. So it only can be used until that end date. But 30 days before that end date, you should submit, if it's a expedited or full board protocol, a continuation review. And they have to be renewed. Okay? If your study expires, no activities can take place, including and analyzing identifiable data until you get the study removed. Okay, so you have to, during that lapse, you would have to stop all activities. Exempt studies don't have to be renewed. Okay. If you want to make a change, okay, you have to submit to the IRB and get approval for that change before you implement that change. There is an exception. Suppose you're doing a study and something has to be done. It says unless a change needs to be implemented immediately to minimize an imminent harm to subjects. That might happen to you. This, for example, if you were doing international research, you might be out in the field and something happens and you can't actually get a modification through the IRB. You need to make the change if it's there to protect the subjects, okay? Then you notify the IRB and what that is, okay? You also need to report any unanticipated problems, major or minor deviations in your study, serious events, and subject complaints. Just want to pass on this little piece of information. I would occasionally receive subject complaints in my office for studies. Do you know what the number one thing that people complain about? Anybody want to take a guess? How much they were paid. If they're supposed to get $5 and they didn't get $5, they complain. So the biggest complaint, and that doesn't seem to be very, important or risky, but people pay attention. If you say you're going to give them a gift card or whatever, and if they didn't get that gift card or anything, they'll call the IRB. So, make sure you follow through if you're going to do that. I'm not saying you have to pay them. I'm not saying you have to give card, but if you say, I'm going to have a drawing, and I'm going to give away 3 $25 Amazon gift cards, okay? And then you just want to make sure that you can follow through with that. Any changes in research personnel has to be approved before they can start, which means they have to do, the city training and the conflict of interest form and the individual investigator agreement. So, yeah. Yes. Yep. No doubt. Yep. Not. This is not necessarily related, but we did have a study at Columbia that was. It used deception, and it used academics, and they were pretty pissed off about it. And I took about 150 complaints over the phone, and I had to keep a spreadsheet, of all the complaints and who they were, and it was a big deal. And so, yeah, we let you know. But I mean, you won't have that kind of a situation, but yeah, we keep a record of it. Yeah. But the biggest complaint is, I didn't get my money, even if it's $5 or $10. So just so you know. Study closures. So when you're all done, okay, and everything's done, you've even done analyzing the data. You submit a closure to the IRB. So then we know that record is closed there. Does anybody have any questions? Anything? So just a recommendation, I would keep, I guess you're going to get electronic version of this PDF, keep it around. There's a couple links in there. Just look at it before you submit, or go to the guidelines on Blackboard. There are the guidelines with attachments to them with the forms and the translation certificate of accuracy and so on, and just take a look at it. So So thank you. All right. So just wanted to comment on a couple of the things that I had in the last presentation because people have been asking me. So the Albizu's SB Rainey guidelines have a thing about notifying the IRB of unanticipated problems, okay? Now, Jeff this morning talked about if you need to anticipate if there could be a problem and write into your study what that would be and what you would do about it. In that case, that's anticipated, and you could just follow your study if it happens and you take care of it because the IRB has seen it and they know what's going to happen. It's when you don't anticipate a problem and something happens that it's considered unanticipated, and it does get reported to the IRB. So just kind of want to make that distinction, and the IRB will want to know, did that anticipated problem increase the risk for subjects? That's really the important part. So I'll give you an example, which I thought was kind of an unusual example. It was a social and behavioral study. So we had a social work study. The PI was a great PI, very good, detailed PI, knew how to do human subjects research. She was doing an educational study online on the web with like 10, 11, 12-year-old girls. And it was about, using, it was about using, smoking cigarettes and using alcohol or drugs. And they were to do, and she had parental permission. Child were, provided assent. They were like sort of, middle schoolers. And they were doing the study. It was all online. And suddenly on one of the computers, on one of these young girls, pornography showed up. Okay, so the mother called the investigator, and the investigator immediately shut down the website. Then she got the IT people involved, and she reported it right away to the IRB. Now that's funny because when I told my my coworkers in the biomedical center, they're like, "What? An unanticipated problem with pornography showing up on a computer? What do you like?" I just said, "You know what? I'm reporting this to the IRB. We're going to get this to the IRB." So she did report to the IRB what happened, and then she had IT check it out, and had who people were running the website check it out, and and she tried it and all this stuff. So it turns out that pornography was on that young girl's family's computer, not on the study site. But she then wrote into her a modification into her study when she notified the IRB that, if this happens, I will immediately shut down the site and I'll, investigate and all this stuff. So that was sort of, who could have anticipated that you would have this study on a website that was supposed to be protected and everything, that like pornography would show up in a minor, it was just, didn't know. But now she includes it in her study. And so that's sort of an example of unanticipated, problem and so on. Scott. Yeah, the IRB will ask you if you think it was related to the research, yes, and then if it raised the risk to subjects. So sometimes people like to, investigators report it and say not related. They make that decision that it's not related to this study, but it's still reportable to the IRB. Particularly at continuing review, if those things happen. If it's a serious issue, then report it right away to the IRB, even if it turns out it's not related to the study. And it did not, whether or not it raises risk. But you know what? When in doubt, send it to the IRB, because then you're covered, and you can get support from the IRB for help, because the IRB actually helped this investigator figure out like what to do about this situation. So that's another point I wanted to make. So the last thing I want to show you is that in your packet you have a Brainy form, Brainy symbol at the top of it, and it says Brainy's IRB Manager System and Brainy's Smart System. Do you see that there? And it's 2 pages, both sides of 1 page rather. Sometime in the future, and this is a decision that Albizu administration needs to make, rather than emailing me your submission, we're going to have you submit directly into a database called IRB manager for your studies. Right now, when I get your study, I attach it and I work through this database called IRB Manager, and when you get your stamping and you get your approval letter, it's all done through the IRB Manager. So I just thought today I would like to show you just a demonstration of how it works. This is not necessarily a training, you know. If this goes forward, there is training available, web training. Some of you may not need training to use the system because it might just be intuitive to you. So, you know, that's up to you whether I think you would ever need training. There are also some PowerPoints available about how to use some of this in IRB Manager. So the idea is that before you can access the system and submit your studies, you have to sign this form. This is a user agreement form or a user access form. And you can see that on the bottom, I guess it's the back page, you sign it and you date it. So before you would have access to this, okay, you would have to sign this form in ink, and you can either scan it and send it to Brainy, the information is on there, or you could fax it to them. Oh, you could also, if someone has access to Brainy and they're on your study, they can sign it and you can attach it in the system itself if somebody else is already submitting your studies in the form there. So the PIs on the Albizu studies would all need to have access to the system. Any co-investigators or anybody who the PI designates as somebody who would be submitting documents. Okay, and that's up to the PI to decide. The reason is someone else, like a co-investigator, a research assistant, a research coordinator, could be doing this paperwork in the system, but at the end, before it gets submitted to the Brainy IRB, the PI has to approve it within the system. Okay, so this is all for the future, but I just wanted to show you what a user access form is like. Has to be signed in ink, and then I'll demonstrate the system for you. The purpose of this is to eliminate you trying to hopefully guess what you have to submit. Because once you log on, the system will ask you questions, it will prompt you, it will tell you what needs to be uploaded, what kind of forms, it will give you explanations. You can actually write notes into the system if you have questions. So it won't allow you to proceed until you sort of have your ducks in a row, so to speak. So first of all, you need to know who's the PI. PI's, information has to be in there. You have to have the CV for the PI. There's city training, unless those, like the city training is already on file in the system. Any co-investigators, the individual investigator agreements that you have to sign, the conflict of interest. So it prompts you as you go along. You can be in the middle of your application and save it for later. You can complete it all at once. It's entirely up to you. And the PI, as I said, has to have access, as well as anybody else the PI wants to provide access who will be actually doing stuff in IRB Manager. So let me just show you how it works here. So this is the Brainy website. And if you go to the Brainy website, there is right here, it says IRB Manager. There's the link to it right there. So this form, when you submit it to Brainy, allows you to set up a username and a password. One of the points of that, and as you sign this form, it explains that to you, is once you sign this and submit this to Brainy, okay, when you're doing a submission to the IRB, okay, as long as you sign in and use your password, that's considered to be a legal signature. Okay, so once you send this in, whatever you do in here and you submit is considered legal. Okay, and you're responsible, but it's you don't have to necessarily put your signature on everything as you do it. Okay, so this kind of explains that your username and password is considered like your legal documentation for your submission there. So if I go here, says log on to IRB Manager. So once you submit your form, you will get a username and password. So I'll put mine in. Hopefully I'm spelling everything. All right, it worked. Okay. So this is what it looks like for me, because I have administrative privileges in the system. Yours would look a little different here. So the dashboard is what you would see, and this is what it looks like when you log in. Okay, mine's a little different. And you'll notice it right here, it says Albizu New Study. So we've set this up already specifically for Albizu studies. So the first thing here, and I can read through, it identifies Carlos Albizu University, Miami campus. Here's the PI. It knows who I am. It has my contact information already in there. So when you do yours, it'll have yours in there. It already knows the date. And I'm going to initiate a new research project submission. Okay. Here, it says add note. So if you're doing this and you want to add some information or you want to ask a question or whatever, you can always click on this add note, and you could have here, you could ask a question. All right. Cancel it. So here it gives you instructions. Page jump. What that simply means is that basically your application has different pages. Right now we're just on the organization and research staff. But let's suppose I did a application and I got on a second time, I could jump from one page to the next. Okay. These I buttons are information. The little blue circles are good to click to explain what the heck is going on. Answer all questions. Use the add note link to explain your responses if you need. Attach required documents. You can do save for later if you don't have to do it all at one time. And then click submit at the end. So as I go through and so on, here's where, like for example, if ever the Puerto Rican campus was included, we might have a menu. Right now it's only the Miami campus. If you've discussed your submission with anybody, you could put a name in here. Oh, I misspelled my name. You don't have to put anything in there. It notifies you, according to Albizu policy, students cannot be PI. Enter name of a faculty member. I'm just going to put my name in there. Okay. Relationship to the organization. Right now it's faculty because that's the only option at Albizu. The department, so maybe I'm going to make up psychology. Attach the PI's training completion certificate. So here I go here. Here it is, I didn't see it. Okay. So you hopefully will have documents ready or some documents ready, on your computer, and you can select a document. So I know that I already have a training certificate for the PI, so I go select, and I have to figure out where I put it on here. Is it documents? No, desktop maybe. Where do we put the documents for the, did we put them on the desktop? Yeah, I did have documents stored here. Oh, here it is, right here. Sorry, got it. Okay. So here's my Albizu submission. So I'm going to pretend that, this is the city training. So I click on that. Shoot, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, select. All right. Scroll down. There it is. I'm going to do that one. Okay. Didn't do it, did it? Oh, it's okay, yeah. Kind of, okay, so I have a document here, I attach it. All right, so, you know, even though it says license, you know, there's where I would attach the PI's training. Attach PI's current non-expired curriculum vitae, so then I go down here, and hopefully it's easy for me to go here. Did I put a CV? No. I would have put the license. Okay, so when you go on and it attaches things. Does the PI have a clinical license? I can say yes or no. Then you would add attachment. If I say no, okay, then it's not going to ask me for attachment. Does the IRB have IRB manager user account with Brainy? So, you know, I would say yes. We have a user access form on file. That's good. I put the PI's email in. Right, I can't. Might work. Okay. And then if it knows who I am, typically, then the information shows up. If we have a, let me do it this way, maybe this works. It would recognize the PI if their information is already in there, and then you would submit whether or not it was correct, or let's say, I'm going to put all that. All right, are you adding a co-investigator? Yes. I would put the co-investigator's name, attach, again, the training completion for the co-investigator, current non-expired curriculum video. So right now I'm going to say no. Let's see if I can get on to the next page. No, I'm not doing a co-investigator. Are there any key personnel? No. Attach a signed investigator agreement for all those who are key personnel. All right. All right. And then I can do either save for later, or I can do next. See if it'll take me to the next page. Yeah. So it didn't like something, and it will let me know what it didn't like. CV needs to include affiliation with the current facility, and so on. IRB managers must have a assigned user. So the point is, if you don't have the items that you need, it will notify you of what's required. Then I can go save for later, and it's been saved. And then the next time I log in, it will show. It'll pull up anything that I have in there. So you could have multiple studies in there. And then it'll ask you for the consent form, it'll ask you for any surveys, it'll ask you what your procedures are, you know, surveys, interviews, and so on. And you can, if you're requesting a waiver or documentation consent, it'll prompt you for that, and so on. So that's kind of a really sort of quick demo of what IRB Manager is like, you know. But I think that if we go in this direction and use IRB Manager, it will help you, it will prompt you, and it will really help you understand sort of what the documents are required you submit. So, any questions on that? The decision has not yet been made about like when such a thing would happen, but that's the goal there. So, great.
So a copy of that user form will be added to Blackboard. So we do have a little bit of time left, so I've asked Dr. Cohen to come back up just to talk very briefly about one issue that I think would be very important for Albizu researchers. It's the issue of data repositories So this is something that some faculty might, work with the Goodman Center on. So I'd like to bring Dr. Cohen back up.
I'm not going to, there's a slide thing there, but I'm not going to take the time to go through it, and my voice is still a little raspy. We did want to talk about using data. One of the comments we get often from investigators is, it's just data. Why do I have to worry about this? Why do I have to submit it to the IRB? It's just data. Well, data isn't just data, especially when it's identifiable data. And we talked about the definition. And so using private identifiable information is human subjects research. Identifiable data is people, not just data. There are people involved. The regulations and the IRB review process does allow for research that just uses data, and we talked a bit about some examples of that. But there's one important area which is actually growing in interest in the field, and that's the use of data repositories. So there's two ways that data repositories can be used, and in both cases they help facilitate research involving data. One way is for you. You're gathering data in your research, your study's done, but there may be other uses for that data. There may be other research uses for that data in the future. You don't want to just destroy the data and waste all that data. What you can do is take your data and create a data repository. And you actually can do it from multiple studies and create a data repository. Then, with the appropriate consent, and you would want to build that into your consent process, that the subjects know that you're going to do that. You can then use that data later in other research or release it to colleagues. The other area that it's useful for, and I think it's going to come up more, is when a clinic or a practice collects client data. You can take that client data, create a data, and when I say data repository, it's not a place. It's a virtual thing. You create a data repository of all the patient data, client data. Then that data is now available, and again, you get permission from the clients to do that. That data is now available for research. Now there's two important things here. First of all, the IRB should oversee the creation of that data repository and review the policies and procedures, what kind of consent you obtained to put data into the repository, how the repository is going to be maintained, and then what are the policies for releasing data from that or using data from that repository. That should be reviewed by the IRB. It's not research yet. It's just data. Then, when the data is released, it may or may not need IRB review. The research using the data may or may not need IRB review, and the main advantage of a data repository, aside from having the data to use, is that if you release that data unidentified, guess what? It's not human subjects research anymore. Doesn't need IRB review. And there are ways to do that using IT to release that data without identifiers. If it's being released with identifiers, then you get IRB review for that research study. So I think data repositories, when we're talking to the Goodman Center, and I think you can think about it also for your own research or a department. So, any questions? And I did some slides on that.
Can you talk about, like, let's say at the Goodman Center, if we were to develop a data repository
The phrase they're using now is broad consent. In other words, they're giving consent for the future use of their data. Usually what you want to give them is some parameters to that. So you could say from the Goodman Center, your data will be used for mental health research. Okay? And then they'll know that their data might be used with other mental health research. If you're going to use it for something else, you've gone beyond the parameters, you probably need to reconsent. So, yeah. Only if the clinic is a covered entity. HIPAA is about electronic billing. It's about billing. It's actually about billing. Organizations, even if they have electronic records that don't bill electronically to insurance companies, then they're not covered entities. So you really have to determine, and you need legal counsel to determine whether you're a covered entity or not. And again, as I said earlier, the responsibility is on the covered entity, not the researcher. It's about releasing data. Right. Again, that's the responsibility, the researcher is putting together the documentation for the research that might include an authorization agreement. And by the way, I don't recommend making it part of the consent form, but you can. But the clinic, for example, could come up with an authorization form. Your study's over. It gets added into the repository. No. It's the use of the data. If you're getting identifiable data. If you're getting unidentified, if the repository is releasing unidentifiable data, no, you don't. That's one of the big advantages. And we can help with that. We've helped several clinics set these up.